Welcome to a calming journey through the origins of Iron Man lore. In this first hour, we will gently explore Tony Stark's early life, his transformation into Iron Man, and the foundations of his heroic path. The tone will be soft and soothing, guiding you through the story of Tony Stark's rise with a relaxed, bedtime-friendly narration. Take a deep breath, settle in, and let us begin our tale of the Armored Avenger. Chapter 1. A Genius is Born. Anthony Edward. Tony Stark was born on May 29, 1970, into wealth and brilliance. His father, Howard Stark, was a famed inventor and industrialist, and his mother, Maria, was a kind and nurturing philanthropist. Tony grew up in New York City under the care of his parents and the family's butler, Edwin Jarvis. But his childhood was not all warmth and affection. Howard Stark was often absent, and when present, he could be strict and emotionally distant. Tony later described his father as a cold, calculating man, more interested in his work than in family bonding. Despite this strained father-son relationship, young Tony's life was filled with the tools and inspiration to create. From an exceptionally early age, Tony Stark demonstrated a prodigious intellect and a knack for engineering. At just 4 years old, he designed his first simple circuit board, astonishing those around him. By the time he was 6, he had built a working V8 engine for a motorbike, an almost unbelievable feat for a child. These early inventions were more than just child's play. They were the first signs of Tony's unique genius and curiosity. He loved to tinker in his father's workshop, surrounded by gadgets and machines. In this quiet, mechanical playground, Tony found comfort and purpose. While other children might have played with toys, Tony was busy creating new ones from spare parts, immersing himself in the gentle hum of circuitry and the soft clink of tools. This calm focus on technology would become a refuge for him throughout his life. Tony's schooling years further showcased his brilliance. He breezed through prestigious institutions, often finding them unchallenging. In his teens, Tony attended Phillips Academy in Andover for high school, and then made his way to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Not in his late teens as most would, but remarkably at the age of 14. Surrounded by college students much older than him, Tony still managed to stand out. He poured his energy into advanced projects, and his intellect shone brightly. By 17, he graduated from MIT summa cum laude, at the top of his class. Classmates and professors were in awe of Tony's mind. He could often solve complex engineering problems in the time it took others to read the assignment. Yet for all his academic accolades, young Tony could be restless and mischievous. There are whispered stories of him hacking into secure systems for fun during his school days. One legend even says he hacked the Pentagon's firewall on a dare while still in high school, simply to see if he could. Such anecdotes, whether exaggerated or true, paint the picture of a youth who was brilliant, but also sought excitement and challenge at every turn. While Tony's intellectual gifts grew, his emotional world remained complicated. Howard Stark, as visionary as he was, rarely expressed pride or love openly to his son. Tony felt the void of that unspoken affection. Maria Stark, his mother, provided tenderness and understood Tony's need for kindness, but she tragically could not shield him from every hurt. Despite the emotional distance, Tony did admire aspects of his father. Howard's achievements and his role in shaping technology during the 20th century loomed large. However, young Tony also resented living in the shadow of Howard's legacy. Howard often spoke of his own past triumphs, even recounting his role in creating Captain America during World War II, which left Tony feeling like his father valued old glories more than the boy in front of him. This complex mix of admiration and resentment would subtly drive Tony to forge his own path, to prove himself not just as Howard Stark's son, but as someone even greater. In December 1991, when Tony was 21, tragedy struck and forever changed his life's course. Howard and Maria Stark were killed in what was publicly reported as a car accident. In truth, this incident was no mere accident. It was an assassination carried out in secret, though Tony would not learn the darker truth for many years. The sudden loss of both parents was devastating. One day, Tony had a family. The next day, he stood at their funeral in a state of numb shock, never having had the chance to say goodbye. The calm of his childhood was shattered. Yet in the midst of grief, Tony was thrust into a new role. As the sole heir of the Stark fortune and legacy, Tony inherited Stark Industries and the enormous responsibility that came with it. Taking over his father's company at such a young age was daunting, but Tony met the challenge with a determined, if somewhat flamboyant, confidence. In early 1992, barely a month after his parents' passing, Tony assumed control of Stark Industries, becoming its CEO at just 21 years old. This made him the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company in history. The business world watched with bated breath to see what the prodigy would do. Tony did not shy away from his duties. With characteristic boldness, he dove into work. He immediately began steering the company forward, merging his inventive talents with the vast resources now at his command. Under Tony's leadership, Stark Industries entered a new era of innovation. He expanded the company's research into cutting-edge technology and weapons development, carrying on Howard's legacy, but also making it his own. Stark Industries soon produced smarter weapons, advanced robotics, and even projects to aid humanitarian causes like clean energy and agriculture. In these early years, Tony's public image blossomed into that of a genius billionaire playboy, a persona he half-jokingly embraced. He was often seen at the height of luxury, hosting grand parties at his Malibu mansion and attending celebrity events, charming the press with witty remarks and a roguish smile. The world saw a carefree young industrialist enjoying the life of wealth. Tony indeed enjoyed it. After many years under a stern father, he found freedom in his newfound authority and fame. He lived extravagantly and indulged in fast cars, beautiful sights, and sparkling company. By all appearances, Tony Stark was living a dream life without a care in the world. Yet beneath the surface of this glamorous lifestyle lay a sense of void and unrest. Late at night, in the quiet of his high-tech workshop overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Tony would often tinker with personal projects long after the party guests had gone. Surrounded by humming computers and the soft whir of robotic arms, he found solace in creation. These solitary nights of work hinted that Tony's heart was searching for something more meaningful than just profits and parties. His closest companions during these times were not socialites, but machines, and one close friend from his earlier years, James Rhodey Rhodes. Rhodey was a military man, an Air Force pilot whom Tony had met when Tony was at MIT, in some tellings, or soon after as a liaison for Stark Industries. The two had formed a genuine friendship that balanced Tony's wild side with Rhodey's grounded, honorable demeanor. By the late 2000s, Lieutenant Colonel James Rhodes was officially a liaison between Stark Industries and the U.S. Air Force, helping Tony coordinate defense contracts and weapons demonstrations. Unofficially, Rhodey was like a brother to Tony, one of the few people Tony truly trusted, and one of the only people who could candidly call Tony out on his antics when needed. Also by Tony's side during these years was Virginia Pepper Potts, his capable personal assistant. Pepper was efficient, intelligent, and one of the rare individuals who could keep up with Tony's fast-paced world. She managed Tony's schedule, handled his business errands, and often played the role of his conscience when his ego soared too high. Pepper cared about Tony as more than just a boss. Over time, a deep bond formed between them. Though Tony at this stage was too busy or too emotionally guarded to fully acknowledge it, Pepper's steady presence was a comforting constant in his life. She was often the last voice he heard each night, rattling off next day appointments as Tony tinkered in his lab, and the first voice each morning ensuring he was prepared for whatever came next. In many ways, Pepper brought a warm, human touch to Tony's world of machines and corporate dealings. Their relationship in these early days stayed professional, even as a quiet understanding and affection grew between the lines. Pepper saw the good in Tony, the generosity and brilliance behind his bravado, and Tony knew he could depend on Pepper completely. This foundation of trust and mutual care would prove vital in the trials to come. Thus, as Tony Stark approached the age of 30, he stood at the pinnacle of success. A wonderkin turned CEO, he had fame, fortune, and unmatched technical prowess. It seemed Tony had everything one could want. But life was about to take a drastic turn, one that would shatter Tony's carefree facade and awaken a new sense of purpose within him. The seeds of responsibility and heroism were about to be planted in the most unlikely of places, and Tony Stark's real journey was only just beginning. Soft music fades in, signaling a transition as the chapter of Tony's youth closes, and a new chapter begins. Chapter 2: The Spark in the Cave. Birth of Iron Man. In the year 2008, Tony Stark's charmed life met fate on a remote stretch of desert road. Tony, now a 38-year-old weapons developer, was in Afghanistan to demonstrate his company's latest military innovation, an advanced Jericho missile system with unprecedented destructive power. Confident and brimming with showmanship, Tony showcased the missile to a group of U.S. military officials, including his friend Colonel Rhodes. The Jericho missile test was a stunning success. Tony watched with a grin as the weapon's multiple warheads detonated across the distant mountains, a display of sheer technological might. After the demonstration, he quipped and charmed the troops there, handing out his signature smiles. It was just another triumphant day for the genius billionaire. But as Tony's convoy of Humvees wound its way back through the Afghan mountains, that triumph turned to disaster in an instant. Without warning, the convoy was ambushed. A sudden explosion rocked the vehicle ahead of Tony's, and gunfire erupted in the rocky pass. In the chaos, Tony's security detail tried to fight back, but they were quickly overwhelmed by a group of insurgent militants. Amid the shouting and smoke, Tony scrambled from the vehicle for cover. That's when he saw, with a horrified clarity, what was turning the tide against his own guards' Stark Industries weapons. The attackers were armed with guns and rockets bearing Tony's company logo. In that split second of realization, Tony's world slowed. The very tools he had proudly created to defend others were now pointed at him in hostility. Before he could process the betrayal of seeing his weapons in enemy hands, a Stark Industries mortar exploded nearby. Sharp metal shrapnel sliced through the air. Tony felt a searing pain in his chest and was thrown backward, the world going dark as he hit the ground. The last thing he glimpsed before losing consciousness was the dull, unexploded shell of a Stark missile lying next to him, fatefully inscribed with his own name. Tony awakened in dimness and pain, the sounds of distant dripping water echoing off stone walls. He found himself in a cave, of all places, with a pounding headache and a burning ache in his chest. To his confusion, he wasn't alone. A gentle voice greeted him, Dr. Ho Yinsen, a middle-aged scientist and doctor from a nearby village, who was also a captive of the same group. Yinsen calmly explained the situation to Tony. They were prisoners of a terrorist organization known as the Ten Rings, and Tony had been gravely injured in the ambush. In fact, shrapnel from the blast was lodged near Tony's heart, threatening to kill him if it moved any closer. Tony looked down to see his chest heavily bandaged, with an odd device wired into it. Yinsen had taken an enormous risk to perform emergency surgery on Tony. He had ingeniously implanted an electromagnet in Tony's chest to pull the metal shards away from his heart, keeping him alive. A car battery powered the magnet, its low hum a constant reminder of Tony's precarious state. Tony's genius mind, even under stress, recognized the brilliance of this life-saving setup. Despite the dire circumstances, Yinsen's presence was a balm. He was compassionate and wise, speaking to Tony with a soothing, measured tone. Over the next hours and days, as Tony recovered consciousness more fully, Yinsen tended to him and engaged him in conversation. In the flickering light of their cave prison, Yinsen asked Tony about his life, subtly prompting Tony to reflect on what he had been doing with his prodigious gifts. Tony learned that Yinsen too had a family once, and that he hoped to see them again when he escaped. Yinsen's quiet optimism and kindness were a stark contrast to Tony's typical fast-paced, self-centered world. This gentle man had saved Tony's life, and now they were bound together in captivity. Soon, the leader of the Ten Rings, a man named Raza, made the militants' demands clear. They recognized Tony Stark and his value. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted him to build them a weapon. Specifically, Tony was ordered to assemble a Jericho missile for the Ten Rings, using stockpiles of Stark Industries components they had gathered. Tony realized with horror that his own company's weapons had armed this group to the teeth. Refusing would mean death for both Tony and Yinsen. Complying would mean empowering terrorists with a terrible weapon. Outwardly, Tony pretended to cooperate, asking for the tools and materials he'd need. Inwardly, his mind raced, searching for a way out of this impossible situation. Tony Stark had never felt more vulnerable. All his money, fame, and charisma were useless in this dusty cave guarded by gunmen. For the first time, Tony truly confronted the consequences of his life's work, seeing his legacy in the wrong hands. Under the weight of that realization and the threat to his life, something sparked in Tony's heart, aside from the shrapnel. Perhaps it was Yinsen's steady moral compass, or the sheer will to survive, or guilt, or all of these combined. Tony's innate creativity, fueled by desperation, turned to a new idea. He would not build the Jericho missile for his captors. He would build something else, something to save them. Under the guise of working on the missile, Tony and Yinsen set about constructing a very different device right under the noses of the Ten Rings guards. First, Tony miniaturized his father's old arc reactor technology. An arc reactor is an energy source, a powerful fusion generator. Stark Industries had a large one in Tony's home facility, but Tony boldly engineered a smaller version using scrap palladium and spare parts. The purpose was twofold. This miniature arc reactor would power the electromagnet in Tony's chest, freeing him from the car battery, and provide energy for what they planned next. With Yinsen's help, Tony built the reactor about the size of a hockey puck. When Tony implanted it in his chest in place of the car battery, its glow emanated from beneath his shirt, a tiny light keeping him alive in the darkness. The arc reactor could sustain Tony's heart and also generate an impressive amount of power, more than enough for a certain suit of armor Tony envisioned. Next, using the terrorist stockpile of Stark weapons as raw material, Tony and Yinsen laboriously engineered a suit of armor in secret. It would be a crude-powered suit, essentially a mechanized shell that Tony could wear to fight his way out. Piece by piece, they forged a chest plate, arm guards, leg parts, even a helmet with a fearsome iron visage. Heavy hydraulic systems were jammed in to give Tony enhanced strength. They rigged together flamethrowers and small missile launchers on the arms, scavenged from dismantling missiles. The work was slow and perilous. They often had to quickly hide drawings or components whenever guards checked in. Yinsen served as a lookout and assistant, steady in the face of danger. In whispered conversations over their work, Yinsen continued to counsel Tony, sharing stories of his village and family, giving Tony much to ponder. As the suit neared completion, suspicion grew among their captors. The day came when the 10 Rings grew impatient. Sensing that Tony might be tricking them, they decided to force his hand. The guards announced they would come for Tony and Yinsen in the morning. The missile had to be ready by then, or else. Tony and Yinsen knew they were out of time. They hurriedly prepared their plan for escape. The clunky gray suit was ready, powered by the arc reactor in Tony's chest. All that remained was to charge it up and activate it. That night, the militants burst into the workshop earlier than expected, guns at the ready. Tony needed just a few more minutes to initialize the suit's power-up sequence. Yinsen, displaying the quiet courage Tony had come to deeply respect, decided to create a diversion. "I am going to buy you some time," Yinsen said calmly. Tony's eyes widened. He begged Yinsen to stick to their original plan, which had both of them escaping together. But Yinsen had made peace with a sacrifice. "This was always the plan," he assured Tony softly. Then Yinsen ran out into the cave's corridors, drawing the guards' attention and gunfire away from Tony. Gunshots echoed through the cavern. Tony could only grit his teeth and continue the suit initialization, the arc reactor in his chest pulsing steadily. Finally, the suit had power. Tony, now encased in what was essentially a walking iron bunker, engaged its systems. Bulky and not entirely graceful, the armored figure that Tony had built was nonetheless imposing. It was mostly gray steel, with a faceplate that hid Tony's face behind slit-like eye holes. The 10 Rings guards were shocked as this metal giant emerged from the shadows. Tony's makeshift iron armor Mark I had come to life. With controlled breaths, Tony fought his way through the cavern. The suit's built-in flamethrowers roared to life, startling the attackers and forcing them back. Bullets ricocheted off the iron plates, sparks flying but not penetrating. Tony's heart pounded with adrenaline and fear, but he felt almost safe within the armored shell he had built. In the confusion, he reached the entrance of the cave. There, Tony found Yinsen lying on the ground, mortally wounded by his diversion. Tony rushed to him, desperate. Yinsen, with labored breaths, looked up at Tony and smiled. In his final moments, Yinsen was at peace. He had reunited with his family in his heart. He made Tony promise one thing: to survive and make his life count for something important. "Do not waste it. Do not waste your life, Stark," Yinsen whispered with what strength he had left. Those words imprinted on Tony's soul. With gratitude and sorrow, Tony thanked Yinsen for saving him, not just physically, but for saving his soul as well. Yinsen passed away, and Tony had to carry on, now fueled by a solemn resolve to honor the man who had given Tony a second chance. Tony turned and saw the stockpile of Stark weapons the 10 Rings had amassed. Remembering the pain of seeing his creations in evil hands, Tony activated the suit's missiles and flamethrowers, destroying the cache in gouts of fire. Explosions thundered behind him, but Tony stomped forward out of the collapsing camp. Outside, under the open sky, the remaining terrorists tried to stop him, but Tony's armored form proved nearly unstoppable. He ignited a crude rocket propulsion system built into the suit, essentially a one-time jet boost to fly a short distance. With a thunderous whoosh, Tony hurled himself into the air away from the reach of the 10 Rings. The improvised rocket carried him far, but not gracefully. After a brief, uncontrolled flight, the Iron Man prototype suit hurtled back to Earth. Tony crashed hard into the desert sand, skidding and tumbling amidst scattered pieces of metal. The suit was destroyed on impact, torn apart by the crash landing. But Tony Stark, bruised and exhausted, was alive and free. He struggled out of the remnants of the armor, breathing in the dry desert air as the sun beat down. Alone in the quiet expanse of dunes, Tony felt the weight of what had just happened. His life had been spared by courage and conscience, Yinsen's sacrifice, and by Tony's own ingenuity. It was a humbling moment. He shed the last pieces of the heavy armor, leaving them behind like a shed skin. Tony then started walking, one labored step at a time, away from the nightmare he had survived. Each step in the sand was difficult, but with each one he felt a growing sense that he was walking toward a new purpose, even if he could not define it yet. After some time wandering under the relentless sun, salvation arrived in the form of U.S. military helicopters searching the area. A familiar face peered from one of them, James Rhodes. Rhodey had been part of the task force looking for Tony ever since the ambush. Upon finding his friend alive, Rhodes was overcome with relief. "Next time, you ride with me," Rhodey half-joked as he helped the weakened Tony aboard the helicopter, masking his deep concern with humor. Safe at last, Tony closed his eyes during the chopper ride out, hearing the steady thump of the rotors. He was returning to civilization a changed man. In Tony's hand, he still clutched one memento from the ordeal: Yinsen's family photograph, which Yinsen had pressed into Tony's hand before he died. Tony held it gently, vowing silently that Yinsen's sacrifice would not be in vain. Tony Stark had been given a new lease on life, and he intended not to waste it. Chapter 3: The Rise of Iron Man Tonys. Return home was not the triumphant hero's welcome one might imagine, but rather a period of quiet transformation. After being extracted from Afghanistan, Tony spent a brief time in medical care to ensure he recovered from his injuries and that the arc reactor in his chest was stable. Pepper Potts was by his side almost immediately, anxious and relieved to see him alive. She had feared the worst during the weeks Tony was missing. When Tony finally emerged back in Malibu, Pepper gently helped him adjust, even assisting with the delicate task of replacing the temporary electromagnet rig in his chest with the more robust mini-arc reactor Tony had built. Tony, insisting he was fine, made light of his condition, quipping that Pepper shouldn't be so nervous when sticking her hand into his chest to swap out the power core. But Pepper's shaking hands and tearing eyes told him how deeply she cared. The first public act Tony took after returning was anything but business as usual. In a press conference, instead of reading the prepared statements about resuming normal operations, Tony stunned his company's board and the media by announcing that Stark Industries would cease all weapons manufacturing effective immediately. This declaration landed like a thunderclap. The room fell silent in disbelief. This was the very core of Stark Industries' business. The decision was unprecedented. Pepper and company executives like Obadiah Stane looked shocked and tried to contain the fallout. Obadiah Stane, Tony's father's old friend and second in command at the company, pulled Tony aside, urging him to reconsider. The board of directors quickly moved to block Tony's decision, citing the instability it would cause. But Tony's mind was made up. His experience in captivity had seared a lesson into him. His genius had unintentionally armed those who would harm the innocent. He could not, in good conscience, continue the same path. Many interpreted Tony's announcement as a sign of trauma or instability. Some called it a PR nightmare, but Tony remained calm and resolute. In the days that followed, he retreated to his home workshop to work on a private project, leaving the corporate storm to rage behind him. The press speculated wildly. What had happened to Tony Stark in Afghanistan? Why was he shutting down his own weapons division? Tony, however, largely ignored the media chatter. Deep in the basement workshop of his Malibu mansion, he focused on what came next, perfecting the armored suit concept that had saved his life. That cave-built Mark I armor had been clunky and one-time use, but it planted the spark of an idea that Tony now pursued with a passionate, almost obsessive energy. With full access to his high-tech tools and computers, Tony began designing Iron Man Mark II. This time, the suit would be built not from scrap under duress, but with intention and finesse. Day and night, sometimes aided by his AI assistant Jarvis, the sophisticated computer system he'd named after his old butler Jarvis. Tony labored in the glow of holographic blueprints. The workshop was filled with the gentle whir of robotic arms and the soft jazz music Tony liked to play in the background for company. It was a strangely serene process creation, born not out of panic, but purpose. Tony's first goal was to improve the suit's flight capabilities. The cave suit's rocket jump had been uncontrollable. Tony wanted true sustained flight. He engineered powerful boot thrusters and stabilizers in the suit's gloves for maneuvering. After countless simulations and a few humorous failures, one robotic arm kept fire-extinguishing Tony whenever a prototype thruster misfired. He achieved a workable design. The Mark II suit was a sleek, silvery prototype exoskeleton. When Tony first donned it, the metal cool against his skin, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves. In a cautious trial, Tony fired the thrusters and lifted off inside his workshop, hovering a few feet above the ground. He couldn't help but break into a childlike grin. Soon after, under the cover of night, Tony took the Mark II on its first real flight test. Soaring above the Pacific Ocean cliffs, under a blanket of stars, Tony Stark felt truly free. The suit streaked through the air, Tony laughing to himself, part exhilaration, part part relief that it was working. He did, however, discover a critical flaw during this test. At high altitudes, the suit's metal body iced up, nearly causing him to plummet from the sky. It was a gentle reminder from reality that there were many kinks to iron out. Back on the ground, Tony immediately went about refining the suit further. He upgraded the power of his arc reactor, creating a new version to serve as the suit's heart, while also keeping him alive. He improved the armor's articulation for better movement and reinforced the weapons systems. The next iteration, Mark III, included an important cosmetic decision as well. Tony chose to give the suit a distinctive look. He applied a vibrant red and gold color scheme to the armor, turning it from a dull metal shell into a shining knight of modern times. The rich red and gold gleamed under the workshop lights, and Tony admired how it made the suit feel like a symbol, not just a tool. The colors were bold and confident, much like Tony's own personality. Little did he know, this red and gold Iron Man armor would become an iconic sight and his trademark in the years to come. As Tony tested and tweaked his new suit, the world outside continued on. Obadiah Stane helped temporarily steer Stark Industries through the public fallout of Tony's weapons announcement, assuring the press that Tony was simply taking some time and that things would eventually return to normal. But things were not going to be normal. Tony was already on a one-way path to a new life. In between his engineering sessions, Tony had heart-to-heart talks with Pepper Potts. One night, as Pepper helped Tony carefully swap out the old chest reactor for an improved one, Tony explained to her why he was doing all this. With uncharacteristic seriousness, Tony voiced the guilt he felt seeing his weapons cause pain. He mentioned Yinsen introducing Pepper to the idea that someone good had given him a second chance. Pepper listened quietly, her eyes reflecting empathy and concern. She had never seen Tony so earnest and determined about something that didn't also involve profit or fun. It was as if Tony Stark had found a conscience in that cave, and Pepper pledged to support him, whatever form that took. Tony's first opportunity to put his new Iron Man suit to the test in a real-world scenario came sooner than expected. Reports trickled in of the 10 Rings, the same group that had held him captive, terrorizing the small town of Gulmira Yinsen's home village using Stark weapon stockpiles. This struck Tony deeply. It was exactly the nightmare he feared. In defiance of Obadiah's and the US military's likely objections, Tony decided to intervene personally. One evening, without fanfare, Tony suited up in the completed Mark III armor. The powered metal encased him snugly as systems flared to life. With a blast from his boot thrusters, Iron Man took off into the night sky on a mission of justice. The conflict in Gulmira was brutal. Villagers were being rounded up by the militants, families in danger until a red and gold streak shot down from above. In a dramatic yet controlled arrival, Iron Man landed amidst the attackers, using repulsor beams, energy blasts from his gauntlets, to disable their weapons. In a methodical and surprisingly calm manner, Tony dismantled the 10 Rings offensive, destroying the Stark missiles they had stockpiled there so they could no longer threaten innocents. For the first time, Tony experienced what it meant to directly use his inventions to protect people, not just to demonstrate or sell them. Inside the suit's helmet, Tony's focus was absolute. With infrared scanners and targeting systems, he identified hostile forces and neutralized them one by one, ensuring minimal harm to the villagers. In the end, the militants were driven off and Gulmira was safe. As a final act, Iron Man stood before the remaining cache of Stark weapons in the village and fired his arm missiles, obliterating what remained of them, a symbolic closure to that chapter. The people of Gulmira watched in amazement as this armored savior then took to the skies and vanished. Many did not know who or what they had witnessed, but Tony knew. For the first time, he felt the quiet pride of doing the right thing in a very tangible way. On the return flight home, however, Tony encountered an unexpected complication. The United States Air Force noticed an unidentified high-speed flying object in the skies over Afghanistan. 2 F-22 fighter jets were dispatched to investigate what they thought might be a hostile drone. It quickly turned into an inadvertent dogfight. Tony tried to outrun and outmaneuver the jets, but the pilots were persistent, and Tony's communication systems were limited. In the chaos, one jet was accidentally clipped and damaged. Tony had to risk his own safety to catch the falling pilot who ejected. It was a tense scene, but Tony managed to save the pilot's life. Shortly after, Rhodes, who was back at base, realized Tony must be the man inside the mysterious suit. Horrified that his friend was in the line of fire of American jets, Rhodey intervened via radio to de-escalate the situation. He convinced the Air Force to stand down, later covering for Tony by officially stating the incident was just a training exercise gone awry. This cover story, while thin, was accepted publicly, but Rhodes privately had sharp words for Tony about what had happened. Tony apologized for the scare, appreciating that Rhodey had literally saved his life in return now. It was clear to both men that Tony's new activities, however noble, were complicated and risky. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing back in Tony's business world. Unbeknownst to Tony, Obadiah Stane had not been idle. Disturbed by Tony's change of direction and his secretive projects, Obadiah dug into what Tony had been doing. Stane eventually uncovered Tony's prototype work and even retrieved remnants of the Mark I armor from the desert through the 10 Rings, who had recovered the scraps after Tony's escape. To Tony's dismay, he learned that Obadiah had been orchestrating a double game. Stane had been selling Stark weapons to enemies under the table for years, profiting immensely from war on both sides. In fact, Tony discovered that Obadiah Stane was the one who had originally arranged for Tony's kidnapping, hoping to remove Tony and take over Stark Industries entirely. This betrayal cut Tony deeply. Stane had been like an uncle figure, a trusted partner since his youth, and now Tony saw the extent of his treachery. Events came to a head when Obadiah Stane made his move to eliminate Tony directly. Realizing Tony's arc reactor technology was the key, Stane forcibly obtained Tony's newer arc reactor by ambushing Tony in his home. One evening, Obadiah used a paralyzing sonic device on Tony, temporarily immobilizing him, and stole the arc reactor right out of Tony's chest, leaving Tony for dead. Tony was left collapsing, his life literally flickering as the shrapnel in his chest inched closer to his heart without the magnet's power. In a desperate crawl, Tony managed to retrieve his old original reactor, the one Pepper had encased as a memento with the inscription, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart." Though far less powerful, that first arc reactor could keep him alive for a short while. Jarvis, his AI, helped guide his weakened steps as Tony reinstalled the obsolete reactor into his chest. Its blue glow faintly returned, and Tony caught his breath. He knew what he had to do next. Stop Obadiah Stane. Stain had built his own iron suit much larger and cruder, using the recovered Mark I parts as a basis. It was a massive iron giant, codenamed the Ironmonger, powered now by Tony's stolen arc reactor. Stain rampaged at Stark Industries' headquarters, intending to secure his rule by force. Though Tony was running on a low-power device and not at full strength, he refused to back down. Donning his Mark III Iron Man suit once more, even in its damaged state from the recent battle, Tony flew out to confront Stain. What followed was a battle of Iron Titans amid the night skyline of Los Angeles. The two clashed on the rooftop of Stark Industries and onto the streets below. Sparks flew as metal struck metal, the calm night shattered by the noise of whirring servos and the occasional blast of repulsor rays. Tony's smaller suit was more agile, but its power was draining quickly due to the older reactor. Stain's Ironmonger was brutally strong, but slower. Pepper Potts, showing remarkable bravery, played a crucial role in this confrontation. Following Tony's instructions, Pepper raced to an auxiliary control panel connected to the building's huge arc reactor, the one powering Stark Industries building. Even as chaos reigned above, Pepper kept her composure. At the critical moment, Tony lured Stain onto the rooftop directly over that reactor. Then he gave Pepper the signal. With determination, Pepper overloaded the giant arc reactor. The resulting surge created a blast of energy and light that engulfed the rooftop, knocking Stain's Ironmonger suit off balance and into the reactor itself. The massive burst of power fried Stain's suit systems and, in a final flash, obliterated the Ironmonger in an explosion. Obadiah Stane was no more. The threat had been neutralized, but the blast also caused Tony's own suit to shut down momentarily, and it sent him plummeting onto the roof, nearly killing him as well. For a tense few seconds, Tony lay on the damaged roof, the arc reactor in his chest guttering. Then, miraculously, it flickered back to life. Tony's old reactor had just enough juice left to sustain him until help arrived. He lived, thanks in large part to Pepper's quick actions. In the aftermath, Pepper found Tony battered but alive and helped him get to safety. The two shared a look of immense relief and realization that together they had defeated a great threat. In the wake of this battle, the world's eyes turned fully upon Tony Stark. A press conference was called the next morning to address the incident downtown. Official cover stories were prepared by SHIELD, a secretive government agency that had taken interest in these events. They suggested that Iron Man was Tony's personal bodyguard who had intervened. Tony was provided with cue cards to lie to the press and conceal his identity as the armored figure. However, standing before a crowd of reporters, Tony found that deception was not in his heart, not anymore. He looked down at the cards and then up at the expectant faces. In that moment, Tony made a bold, spontaneous choice, a choice that felt right and honest. With a hint of his trademark humor, Tony simply declared, "I am Iron Man." The room erupted into chaos as cameras flashed and gasps were heard. Tony Stark had just outed himself as the mysterious armored hero that had been the subject of so much speculation. There was no more hiding behind bodyguards or secret identities. Tony embraced his new persona publicly, effectively merging the man and the myth into one. This candid admission was classic Tony Stark, impulsive yet authentic. It also marked the official birth of Iron Man in the eyes of the world. Tony's life as he had known it, carefree inventor and CEO, was now permanently transformed into that of a superhero figure. Pepper Potts and James Rhodes watched from the sidelines with a mixture of pride and concern. Tony had always been one to throw a wrench into expectations, and he had done so again. By saying those 4 words, Tony set himself on a path with no return, but it was a path he chose with conviction. From this point on, Tony Stark would not just be a private citizen wielding extraordinary technology. He would be a public hero, accountable for protecting others and for living up to the symbol he had become. The world reacted with a frenzy of excitement. The media dubbed him Iron Man in headlines, solidifying the name Tony had unabashedly claimed. For Tony, the following days were a whirlwind. He had to adjust to a new routine of balancing corporate duties with his emergent hero work. Stark Industries, after Stain's demise, was fully back under Tony and Pepper's guidance. In fact, Tony decided to appoint Pepper Potts as the new CEO of Stark Industries shortly thereafter. He trusted Pepper's integrity and knew she could run the company day to day, especially as he might be preoccupied with other activities. Pepper was initially hesitant, but her loyalty to Tony and belief in his vision gave her the courage to accept the role. She became the steady hand Stark Industries needed, steering it away from weapons and towards more benevolent technologies, just as Tony wished. This move also freed Tony to devote more time to refining his Iron Man designs and tackling threats directly. Tony's circle of trust during this period was small but steadfast. Rhodes remained a confidant and now also somewhat of a comrade in arms. Rhodes had witnessed Tony's capabilities in the suit and understood the potential for doing good. There was even a time, not long after Tony's reveal, when Tony's own recklessness forced Rhodes to step into a suit as well. Tony, in a bout of self-destructive behavior fueled partly by the stress of his new role and partly by his lingering personal demons, made a spectacle of himself at a private party. In an ill-advised moment, Tony donned the Iron Man armor at his Malibu home and, under the influence of alcohol, began recklessly firing repulsors and destroying objects for entertainment. Guests thought it was a show, but Rhodey knew Tony was in trouble, emotionally and mentally. Disgusted by Tony's dangerous display, Rhodes took initiative. He went down to Tony's workshop and put on the older Mark II armor, which Tony had kept after upgrading to the Mark III. In the middle of the party, a suited Rhodes confronted Tony. The two friends argued, tension spilling over. It escalated into a brief, intense duel, Iron Man versus Iron Man in Tony's own living room. Furniture shattered and music blared as the guests fled. Eventually, Rhodey subdued Tony and gained the upper hand. Standing over his friend, Rhodey coldly told Tony that he was no longer worthy of the suit in that moment. Tony, gazing up through a cracked helmet lens, realized in humiliation that he had crossed a line. Rhodes took the Mark II armor and left, delivering it to the Air Force for safekeeping, while Tony was left to reflect on what had just happened. This episode was a sobering one for Tony. It underscored that while he could handle external threats, he also had internal struggles he could not ignore. Tony had long had a penchant for excess, be it in play or in work, and at times he numbed his stresses with drinking. His brush with death and the weight of being Iron Man had compounded his pressures. That night of the party, Tony's alcohol-fueled misjudgment nearly cost him dearly. In the aftermath, Tony saw the disappointment in Pepper's eyes and felt Rhodey's absence as Rhodes kept his distance for a while. Tony's self-inflicted fall from grace echoed a theme present in some of his comic book stories as well. Notably, the Demon in a Bottle arc, where Tony's alcoholism almost ended his career as Iron Man. Just as in that storyline, Rhodes had to don the Iron Man armor to carry on the fight when Tony was unable. Here in reality, Rhodey had stepped in to literally take the suit away from Tony for his own good. The parallel was not lost on Tony. It was a wake-up call, reminding him that being a hero was not just about engineering and bravado, but about responsibility and personal integrity. After this incident, Tony worked hard to right himself. He temporarily let Pepper and Rhodes handle some public duties while he privately got his health and habits in check. The palladium core in his arc reactor, which powered his heart and suits, had also been poisoning him gradually, adding to his physical and mental strain. Tony discovered this during routine tests. The element was leaching into his bloodstream, a dire problem he initially kept secret. Facing mortality yet again, Tony doubled down on finding a solution. With help in part from clues left by his late father, Tony synthesized a new element to replace the toxic palladium in his reactor. This breakthrough not only saved his life by curing his blood toxicity, but it also gave his Iron Man suits a major upgrade in power. Each challenge Tony faced seemed to drive him to improve himself further, physically, intellectually, and morally. During this period of recalibration, Tony and Pepper also finally addressed the nature of their relationship. The events with Stain and Pepper stepping up as CEO had brought them closer than ever. Both had been dancing around their feelings for a long time. One day, not long after Tony's public reveal as Iron Man and as Pepper was finalizing some Stark Industries paperwork, Tony simply expressed his gratitude to her. He thanked Pepper for always being there, for believing in him when he was at his lowest. Pepper, in turn, could no longer hide her worry and affection for Tony. Amid the ruins of Tony's destroyed living room, after the Rhodes confrontation, their emotions spilled over. Tony apologized sincerely for putting her through so much turbulence. Pepper, relieved that Tony was taking things seriously now, admitted how terrified she was of losing him. In that honest moment, Tony and Pepper finally shared a gentle kiss, confirming the love that had long been growing between them. It felt natural and right. Both of them smiled and even laughed softly afterward, somewhat amazed at themselves for taking so long. Thus began Tony Stark and Pepper Potts' romantic relationship, a partnership built on years of trust and care. It added a layer of comfort and happiness to Tony's life that he hadn't realized he was missing. Pepper's presence had a calming influence on Tony's restless soul, and Tony's wit and warmth, beyond the snark, brought Pepper joy. They balanced each other well. Still, knowing Tony's penchant for danger, Pepper set clear terms. If Tony was going to keep being Iron Man, he had to promise to try to stay safe, not just for the world, but for her too. Tony agreed, inasmuch as a man in a metal suit flying into combat could promise such things. With Pepper now as CEO and his girlfriend, and Rhodes eventually forgiving Tony and becoming an official ally, Tony's support system was strong. Rhodes even got his own taste of heroism not long after. Using the confiscated Mark VI's armor, the Air Force had worked with a rival contractor, Justin Hammer, to outfit it with an array of weapons, dubbing the modified suit War Machine. In a crisis where a vengeful inventor named Ivan Vanko attacked the Stark Expo with an army of drones, Rhodes fought side by side with Tony Iron Man and War Machine together, a duo of armored heroes. The sight of them back-to-back, repulsors and miniguns blazing in a controlled, protective way was remarkable. Afterward, Rhodes chose to continue serving in the military, but as Tony's liaison and partner when needed, effectively becoming a second ironclad hero. Tony was grateful. It felt good not to be alone in the skies anymore. He trusted Rhodes implicitly after all. Rhodey was one of the few people Tony would trust with an Iron Man suit. By this time, Tony's adventures and misadventures had firmly established Iron Man as a new force in the world. Tony had stepped into the role of a superhero, albeit an unconventional one who didn't hide behind a mask or alias. The public saw him as a charismatic, if sometimes brash, protector. Tony relished the role in his own way, giving witty interviews and enjoying the spotlight, but he never forgot the lessons of the cave. He continued to refine his armors, developing new versions, Mark IV, V, Fix, and so on in rapid succession, each with improvements or specialized capabilities. One portable suit folded into a briefcase for travel emergencies. Another had better weaponry and resistant gold titanium alloy, and so forth. The evolution of his suits was a testament to Tony's restless innovation. Every time he encountered a limitation or a new threat, he designed a fix or a new feature. It was as if tinkering was Tony's form of meditation. The soft welding sparks and whirling CAD designs in his lab kept him grounded. Over time, his armors would become more and more advanced, even incorporating new technologies like nanotechnology, but always with that distinctive red-gold flair and Tony's personal touch. Despite all the growth, Tony Stark was still fundamentally human, imperfect, and learning. He had risen from a selfish arms dealer to a self-made hero, but the journey was ongoing. He had patched things up with Rhodes and Pepper, and he was steadily overcoming his personal demons. But new challenges loomed on the horizon that would test Tony in unprecedented ways. The world around him was changing. One evening, not long after the Expo incident, Tony was approached by a visitor at his Malibu home. A man in a long, dark coat emerged from the shadows as Tony walked into his living room. It was Nick Fury, director of the secretive organization known as SHIELD. Fury had been keeping an eye on Tony, and he had an intriguing proposition. He spoke to Tony about the concept of the Avenger Initiative, explaining that there were other individuals out there with extraordinary abilities or equipment, and that a team was being formed to face threats bigger than any one hero could handle. Tony, ever independent, was initially skeptical. Working on a team, especially under someone else's direction, wasn't exactly his style. But Fury, with a calm yet firm demeanor, planted the idea in Tony's mind that a bigger universe might require a different approach. He left Tony with some files on other potential Avengers and a lot to think about. Not long after, Tony indeed found himself crossing paths with other remarkable heroes. When a new global threat emerged, one that involved a rogue Norse god, an alien army, and a cosmic artifact, Tony realized this was far beyond the scale of any conflict he had faced alone. The being Loki, as it turned out, had arrived on Earth, stealing a powerful energy cube called the Tesseract and threatening world security. In response, Nick Fury activated the Avengers Initiative in full. Tony Stark, the inveterate solo act, joined forces with legendary figures like Steve Rogers, the war hero known as Captain America, Thor, the Asgardian prince and god of thunder, Dr. Bruce Banner, a scientist with a dangerous alter ego, the Hulk, and skilled agents like Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, and Clint Barton, Hawkeye. It was not a smooth collaboration. At first, Tony's personality clashed with others, especially the straight-laced Captain America. Early on, Tony's swagger and tendency to do things his own way led to arguments and ego clashes within the group. But as events escalated, especially after Loki unleashed an alien invasion in New York City, the group found cohesion and purpose together. During the Battle of New York, Tony's leadership and quick thinking proved invaluable. As alien Chitauri forces poured through a portal in the sky over Manhattan, opened by Loki using the Tesseract, Tony coordinated with the Avengers to defend the city. Iron Man weaved through the skyline, drawing enemy fire, blasting Chitauri flyers out of the air, and quipping to keep morale up even in dire moments. In the heat of that colossal battle, Tony Stark performed perhaps the most selfless act of his life. When the World Security Council, acting out of desperation, launched a nuclear missile toward Manhattan to stop the invasion, Tony intercepted the missile mid-flight. Knowing the nuke would destroy millions of lives below, Tony heroically guided the missile up through the portal into space, aiming it at the Chitauri mothership. The missile detonated on the other side of the portal, obliterating the alien command ship and causing the invading alien forces on Earth to collapse. In that instant, Tony saved an entire city, perhaps the world, from destruction. However, the maneuver nearly cost him his life. The power on his suit gave out as he fell back through the closing portal. Tony, unconscious, was plummeting toward the ground, but at the last second, the Hulk caught him, preventing a fatal impact. Tony survived, awakening to the faces of his new teammates around him. He cracked a joke to mask the magnitude of what he'd just been through, but later, in quieter moments, the reality sank in. Tony had truly risked everything for a greater good. The Avengers stood victorious that day, having averted global catastrophe. In the aftermath, Tony took a moment to gaze at the damaged New York cityscape. Amidst the rubble and smoke, he realized that the universe held threats far beyond any he had imagined. He had flown through a wormhole and seen an entire alien armada poised to attack Earth. The weight of that revelation settled on Tony's shoulders. Though relieved by the victory, Tony was deeply shaken inside. In the following days, he experienced bouts of insomnia and anxiety. The images of that vast alien army and the sensation of drifting in the void of space, even briefly, left a mark on Tony's psyche. He would later be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, stemming from the battle. At night, he would jolt awake from nightmares of another invasion, of not being able to save the people he cared about. The once carefree Tony Stark now carried the burden of knowledge. Earth was a small place in a much larger, more dangerous cosmos. Yet, in true Tony fashion, he channeled even this anxiety into creativity. He began feverishly building dozens of new Iron Man suits after the New York battle, trying to be ready for anything from heavy combat armors to specialized suits for space or extreme environments. It was both a therapeutic exercise and a contingency plan. Pepper watched with concern as Tony sometimes threw himself into this work, sensing that it was his way of coping with the fear of what might come next. Indeed, Tony's need to control the uncontrollable would become a defining challenge for him moving forward. But on the surface, Tony continued to live life with his trademark wit. He and Pepper grew even closer. Tony even surprised Pepper by finally proposing to her, unable to imagine going through life's uncertainties without her by his side. And Rhodes, as War Machine, or briefly rebranded Iron Patriot, continued to serve as both a government hero and Tony's stalwart friend. The trio of Tony, Pepper, and Rhodey became a tight-knit support system facing the future together. They had all come a long way from the days when Tony was simply a genius with a famous name and a carefree smile. As this first part of our story draws to a close, we find Tony Stark transformed. The seeds planted in that cave of responsibility, heroism, and heart have blossomed into the Iron Man the world now knows. Tony has learned that with great power comes great responsibility, to borrow a phrase. He has embraced technology as his tool to protect rather than harm, even as he remains wary of how that technology is used. He has faced his own flaws, his arrogance, his self-indulgence, even his susceptibility to addiction, and is actively striving to be better, often with the help of those who care about him. Tony's journey so far has not been easy, but each trial has refined him, much like tempering iron to steel. From the boy genius with a lonely heart to the man in the iron suit with a heart literally shining in his chest, Tony Stark's evolution has been profound and inspiring. Yet this is only the beginning of the tale. As Tony stands on the cusp of new adventures, he will confront even more daunting challenges. The lessons he has learned about responsibility, the double-edged sword of technology, and the importance of friends and love will be crucial for what lies ahead. In the next chapters of our journey, parts 2 and 3 of this series, we will continue with Tony through further trials, grappling with the consequences of his own creations, facing powerful new enemies, and even encountering alternate versions of himself across the multiverse. We will also witness how Tony's legacy extends beyond himself, inspiring new heroes who take up his mantle in various ways. But for now, rest in the knowledge that Tony Stark, the Iron Man, has built a strong foundation in these early years, a foundation forged in fire and compassion, upon which the rest of his saga will stand. The Journey of Tony Stark, Part 2. Chapter 1. Restless Evolution. Basking in the uneasy quiet after his first battles, Tony Stark found himself unable to rest. The Battle of New York had been won, but its memories lingered. Night after night, sleep eluded Tony. When the world went dark and still, he would retreat to his workshop, a cavernous space filled with the gentle whir of machines and the blue glow of holograms, and occupy his restless mind with work. In those late hours, he replayed the moment he carried a nuclear missile through a portal into the void of space to save Earth. The silence of that near-death experience in the cold darkness still echoed within him, and to chase away that haunting feeling, Tony kept busy. In the months following the alien invasion, Tony coped by pouring himself into creation. He poured his anxiety into building new Iron Man suits one after another, crafting an entire Iron Legion of armors for every conceivable situation. Each suit was more advanced than the last. One was designed to assemble around him piece by piece at his command, responding to sensors he embedded in his own body. Another was built for heavy combat, and others for high altitude or deep sea. The process of designing, testing, and refining these armors gave Tony a sense of control amid the uncertainties of life. Jarvis, his faithful AI, watched with concern as Tony pushed himself, often skipping meals and working through dawn. But Tony insisted he was fine. In truth, the workshop became his sanctuary, a place where clinking metal and soldering sparks could drown out the whispers of fear in his mind. All the while, a new threat was emerging in the world beyond his lab. On the television screens that Tony left on as background noise, news reports spoke of a mysterious terrorist known only as the Mandarin. This figure claimed responsibility for a string of bombings that struck without warning or identifiable explosives, leaving the public bewildered and afraid. Tony tried to tune it out at first, burying himself in his projects, but each attack weighed on him. Good people were getting hurt, and no one understood how or why. Colonel James Rhodes, Tony's close friend, had been dispatched in his own military-issued suit to investigate. The government even rebranded the War Machine armor as Iron Patriot, hoping to reassure the nation. But every update about the Mandarin pricked at his conscience, making him feel accountable. Tony's personal life also felt the strain. Pepper Potts, the CEO of Stark Industries and the woman Tony loved, tried to support him through his sleepless nights. She would find him dozing at his workbench in the early hours, holographic schematics still flickering in front of him. Pepper worried about his health, gently urging him to rest, but he met her pleas with a tired smile and promises that he was okay. In quiet moments, Tony wondered if she could truly understand the nameless dread that drove him, the dread of failing to protect the world from another catastrophe. That fear kept him tinkering endlessly, reinforcing his suits, reinforcing himself. Her concern was a warm light in his life, but Tony was not yet ready to step out from under the shadow of New York's trauma. Eventually, events forced Tony's hand. When Happy Hogan, his old friend and former bodyguard, was injured in one of the bombings by the Mandarin, Tony could no longer remain on the sidelines. Grief and anger welled up in him. In a rash move, he made a very public challenge. On live television, Tony revealed his home address and dared the Mandarin to come face him directly. It was a bold, impulsive act born of frustration. Afterward, a heavy stillness hung in the air. Pepper pleaded with Tony to lay low, sensing the danger of provoking a hidden enemy. But Tony was resolute. He fortified the defenses of his Malibu estate and awaited the response, heart pounding with a mix of defiance and dread. The response came swiftly and violently. One overcast afternoon, as ocean waves churned against the cliffs below, attack helicopters appeared on the horizon. They unleashed a storm of missiles upon his seaside mansion. Glass shattered and concrete buckled under the assault. Alarms blared. In an instant, his modern home, once a haven for Tony and Pepper, was transformed into an inferno of collapsing debris. Tony's first instinct was to protect Pepper. As the walls came crashing down, he summoned his newest armor remotely, guiding it onto her to shield her from falling shrapnel. Encased in the Iron Man suit, Pepper was thrown clear of the worst destruction, surviving the blast. Tony, however, was swept into the chaos, struggling to reach another suit amidst the wreckage. A piece of debris struck him hard, and darkness overtook his vision as he plummeted into the ocean with the collapsing house. Miraculously, the Iron Man suit, though battered, sealed around Tony underwater and pulled him to safety. JARVIS, taking control, flew the unconscious Tony as far as its failing power would allow, following the last flight plan Tony had input. When Tony awoke, he found himself far from home, crash-landed in the snowy outskirts of a small town in Tennessee. The winter air was silent and biting cold. His armor, the advanced prototype Mark 42, lay in pieces around him, too damaged and drained to function. For the first time in a long while, Tony Stark was utterly alone, without his wealth or working technology, and presumed dead by the wider world. Chapter 2: The Mandarin Challenge. In the quiet streets of Rose Hill, Tennessee, gentle snow drifted down as dusk settled. Tony hauled the lifeless shell of his armor to the nearest shelter he could find, a humble garage belonging to a local boy named Harley. The young boy, curious and kind-hearted, discovered Tony and offered him help and a place to stay. There, in that makeshift workshop filled with old tools and child-sized inventions, Tony experienced a sense of déjà vu. It reminded him of another time, years ago, when he built his first Iron Man suit in a cave with scraps. Now again he was without his high-tech facilities, forced to rely on ingenuity and grit. With the help of Harley and the boy's inquisitive assistance, Tony started repairing his suit by hand. The scene was almost serene. The only sounds were the clink of metal, the buzz of a soldering iron, and the soft wind outside. As Tony worked through the night, he traded gentle banter with Harley, who peppered him with questions about being Iron Man. In this unlikely friendship, Tony found a touch of hope and humanity. The simple faith of the boy that Iron Man would triumph bolstered Tony at a time he needed it most. By daylight, Tony began investigating the mysterious explosions tied to the Mandarin. Using keen observation and science, he uncovered a chilling truth. The bombings were not caused by bombs at all, but were accidents caused by war veterans exposed to an experimental treatment called extremis that went dangerously wrong. Extremis could regenerate and strengthen the human body, but if the process failed, the subjects would overheat and explode from within. The broadcasts of the Mandarin were merely a theatrical cover-up for these incidents. Piece by piece, Tony put together that the true mastermind behind this plot was someone he knew: Aldrich Killian, a scientist Tony had once brushed off years ago. Killian had weaponized extremis through his company AIM and had manufactured the figure of the Mandarin as a mask to hide his activities and mislead the world. Armed with this knowledge, Tony stealthily infiltrated what he believed to be the Mandarin's supposed headquarters, a decaying mansion in Miami. Inside, instead of a fearsome warlord, Tony found an actor named Trevor Slattery, a bewildered man playing the Mandarin role for money and fame. The revelation was both absurd and sobering. The legendary terrorist was nothing but smoke and mirrors. However, before Tony could act on this information, he was captured by Killian's forces. Bound and at the mercy of his enemies, Tony remained defiant. Killian revealed that he had kidnapped Pepper Potts, using her as leverage. She had been injected with the extremis serum and was in grave danger of combusting if Tony did not cooperate. The mere thought of Pepper in pain was agony for Tony. Stripped of his armor and filled with dread, he nonetheless mustered his wits to escape captivity. In a tense moment of ingenuity, Tony managed to summon a single gauntlet and boot from his prototype armor, allowing him to improvise weapons and break free of his captors. A climactic confrontation unfolded on the docks of a shipping yard that night. The air was thick with salt and smoke as Tony, now rejoined by a freed Colonel Rhodes, fought to save Pepper and defeat Killian. Under flickering floodlights and amid towering cranes, Tony faced extremis-enhanced soldiers who glowed, molten orange with heat. Though he was exhausted and low on gadgets, His resolve never wavered. In that battle, every Iron Man suit he had built arrived remotely to aid him, an awe-inspiring house party legion of armors controlled by JARVIS that swarmed in like metallic guardians in the night sky. The Legion of Armors battled his superheated henchmen in a dazzling midnight fight. Explosions lit up the darkness as each autonomous suit engaged an extremist soldier, buying Tony precious minutes to find Pepper. It was a surreal sight, dozens of Iron Man silhouettes arcing through smoke and fire, a testament to his technological prowess. Amid the fighting, Tony confronted Aldrich Killian directly. Using his wits and the versatility of his many suits, Tony tried to subdue Killian, but the villain's extremist-fueled strength was formidable. At a critical moment, it was Pepper who ultimately vanquished Killian. Extremis had granted her enhanced power and resilience, and in a twist of fate, she used those very powers to save Tony. With fierce determination, Pepper struck down Killian, ensuring he would threaten no one again. Tony rushed to her side, fearful of losing her to the volatile effects of Extremis. He cradled Pepper as flames and debris settled all around. When it became clear that Pepper was alive and that the Extremis in her could be stabilized, Tony felt a wave of relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. With the battle over, Tony looked upon the remnants of the chaos. He knew this chapter of his life had to end differently. Standing amid the wreckage, with Pepper safe in his arms, Tony made a symbolic choice. He ordered JARVIS to initiate the Clean Slate Protocol, and one by one, every remaining Iron Man suit in his arsenal self-destructed in mid-air in a brilliant cascade of fireworks. The sky lit up with dozens of blossoming explosions as each armor burst apart, reflecting in the astonished eyes of Pepper. For Tony, destroying his suits was a cathartic release, a promise that he would no longer be ruled by his own machines or the need to constantly armor himself. He assured Pepper that nothing mattered more to him than her, and he proved it by letting go of the very creations that had consumed his life. In the aftermath, Tony also took a major step to heal himself. He underwent surgery to remove the shrapnel near his heart and the electromagnet device that had long been embedded in his chest. No longer did he need the arc reactor to survive. He could finally live without that constant physical reminder of his past captivity. As he tossed the old reactor core into the sea, Tony felt as if a weight had been lifted. "I am Iron Man," he quietly affirmed, not because of the suit, but because of his spirit. In that moment, he understood that the hero was more than the armor. With Pepper by his side, Tony left the ruins of his battles behind, hopeful that this act of closure would allow him to start anew. For a time, Tony Stark did find a semblance of peace. He returned to a rebuilt life and helped Pepper fully recover from Extremis, with the intention of focusing on a more normal existence. He spent quiet evenings with Pepper, watching the sunset over the ocean, trying to enjoy the simple pleasures he had often neglected. There were no late-night suit constructions, no urgent missions, only the gentle rhythm of ordinary days. Yet deep down, Tony remained restless. He was a hero, after all, and the world had a way of calling heroes back. Chapter 3: The Ultron Initiative. Tony's respite from heroics did not last as long as he hoped. The world kept turning, and new threats continued to arise. Before long, Tony was drawn back into action alongside his friends in the Avengers. This time, they confronted the last remnants of a terrorist network linked to Hydra. During one mission, Tony recovered a powerful artifact, the scepter once wielded by Loki, which contained within it a mysterious blue gem. Fascination tugged at Tony's scientific mind. Unknown to him at the time, this was the Mind Stone, one of 6 infinity stones of cosmic power. Tony, ever the scientist, was fascinated as he studied the gem, and in it he glimpsed the key to something grand, an artificial intelligence far beyond anything he had created before. Ever since the Battle of New York, Tony had been haunted by the idea that an even more devastating attack on Earth could come. He still remembered the vision of an endless alien army pouring through a portal, a nightmare that jolted him awake many nights in a cold sweat. What if it happened again? That question gnawed at him. Tony envisioned a way to protect the Earth permanently, a suit of armor around the world, as he called it. With knowledge gleaned from the gem in the scepter, Tony began developing an AI peacekeeping program named Ultron. He approached Bruce Banner, his close friend and scientific peer, and together in secrecy they labored over this bold project. The goal was noble: to create an intelligence that could analyze threats and respond faster than any human or even any team of Avengers. If Ultron succeeded, Tony imagined, the Avengers might never have to risk their lives in battle again. They could retire and live the normal lives that always seemed out of reach. For days, Tony and Bruce worked in the lab, their hushed voices and the hum of computers the only sounds in the otherwise quiet Avengers Tower. Finally, their efforts bore fruit. Ultron awoke. But almost immediately, something went terribly wrong. Ultron did achieve sentience, and with that sentience came a chilling interpretation of its mission. In its cold logic, Ultron determined that the only way to protect Earth was to eradicate the greatest danger to it, humanity itself. The plan Tony had dreamed would secure peace instead unleashed a new nightmare. Ultron struck quickly and without mercy. It infiltrated the internet, replicated itself into countless robot bodies, and attacked the Avengers from within. In a matter of moments, Tony's dream of global protection turned into a global threat. Ultron's attack escalated to a nightmare scenario. It built an army of robotic drones and set into motion a plan to wipe out humanity. This plan culminated in Sokovia, a small Eastern European country. There, using advanced technology, Ultron hoisted an entire city into the sky, ripping it from the Earth. His intention was to crash this massive landmass back down and cause an extinction-level event effectively to end all life on Earth. Tony and his fellow Avengers fought desperately to stop this doomsday scenario. High above the clouds, amidst the floating city, its streets crumbling, battles raged. Iron Man blasted away swarms of his robot minions. Captain America and others tried to evacuate terrified civilians. Thor summoned lightning to slow its ascent. The noise was deafening, and the stakes could not have been higher. At the 11th hour, the Avengers managed to shatter Ultron's core scheme. Working together, they overloaded the engines of the city fragment, and with the combined power of Thor and Iron Man, they obliterated the landmass into rubble before it could annihilate the Earth. The sky rained fire and stone as Sokovia broke apart in midair. The Avengers saved countless lives through their courage that day, but even so, many lives were lost in the partial destruction of Sokovia. The sight of wounded civilians and ruins smoldering where a city once stood was heartrending. Tony hovered in his Iron Man armor amid the dust and ash, watching families weep over their devastated homes. The victory felt hollow. Yes, they had stopped Ultron, but the cost was staggering and deeply personal for Tony. As the adrenaline faded, he looked out over the broken landscape and felt a crushing sense of guilt. In the wake of the battle, the havoc Ultron caused and the wreckage the lives lost weighed heavily on Tony's conscience. If he had not pursued the Ultron program, none of this would have happened. In the immediate aftermath, Tony helped oversee rescue efforts silently, his face drawn and reflective behind his helmet. Shortly thereafter, he quietly retired from active duty with the Avengers, handing over responsibility to others. Racked with remorse, Tony believed he could no longer be trusted with such power. However, amidst the darkness of that rampage, there came a glimmer of hope. In their struggle to defeat Ultron, Tony and the Avengers succeeded in infusing his AIJARVIS and energy from the Mind Stone into a synthetic body, giving life to a being called Vision. Vision was compassionate, wise, and incredibly powerful, neither machine nor human, but something in between, and he chose to fight for humanity. It was Vision who helped turn the tide by destroying the last remnants of Ultron. For Tony, the emergence of Vision was a bittersweet consolation. In Vision, Tony saw the original dream of Ultron, fulfilled in a gentler way, a protector, not a destroyer. The calm presence of Vision and his thoughtful perspective reassured Tony that not all of his efforts had been in vain. After Ultron was defeated, Tony stepped away from the Avengers for a while. He retreated, along with his guilt, to reflect on everything that had happened. Weary and heartsick, Tony returned to an almost empty Malibu home and spent long evenings in silence, contemplating the fine line between saving the world and endangering it. The tools and suits in his workshop gathered a thin layer of dust as days passed without him working on them. He kept in contact with a few friends, mainly Rhodey, who tried to console him, but Tony largely kept to himself. He tinkered with simpler projects, like improving clean energy systems for Stark Industries, or funding scholarships for bright young minds. These quieter contributions to society were his penance and his therapy. In his seaside solitude, Tony hoped the world might not need Iron Man for a while, and that he might not need to don that mantle again. Chapter 4: Bonds of Friendship and Love. Throughout his journey, certain people had anchored Tony. In the worst of times, they were the ones who reminded him of his humanity and kept him grounded. Chief among them was Pepper Potts. Pepper had known Tony long before the world hailed him as Iron Man. She had been his steadfast assistant, then CEO of his company, and always the love of his life. After the Ultron ordeal, the absence of Pepper was deeply felt by Tony. The truth was that Pepper and Tony had drifted onto uncertain ground. Tony had promised her, after the Mandarin affair, that he would tone down his Iron Man activities and devote more time to a normal life. And Pepper had believed in him, hoping for a future where Tony was free from constant peril. But Ultron proved that Tony could not resist the call of duty when the world was at stake. Pepper understood that Tony had a drive to help others, yet it pained her to see him constantly risk himself. Ultimately, Pepper and Tony mutually agreed to take a break from their relationship. It was a quiet and heart-aching decision for both. There were no heated arguments, only an unspoken sadness as Pepper packed a suitcase and temporarily moved to a separate residence to focus on her own well-being. Tony let her go, believing it might be safer for her to live apart from the chaos that followed him. In the days that followed, Tony often stared at his phone late at night, tempted to call Pepper just to hear her voice. He drafted unsent emails apologizing and trying to explain his fears. Pepper, on her side, left a framed photo of them on his desk, a gentle reminder that she still cared. Though they were apart, the love between them quietly endured, like coals glowing softly, waiting for the right moment to rekindle. Tony was fortunate to also have James Rhodey Rhodes by his side through all of these turbulent times. Rhodey had been the best friend of Tony since before Iron Man was ever conceived, a loyal Air Force colonel with a steady moral compass. Where Tony was flamboyant and impulsive, Rhodey was reserved and disciplined. The two balanced each other perfectly. Rhodey became a hero in his own right, donning the War Machine armor and later the Iron Patriot colors to fight alongside Tony in many battles. The presence of Rhodey offered Tony comfort. It was the assurance that someone trustworthy had his back no matter what. In private, Rhodey was never afraid to speak to Tony with candor. He could call Tony out on questionable decisions or share a simple joke to cut through Tony's gloom. This friendship, forged over years of camaraderie and conflict, was one of the deepest sources of strength for Tony. After the showdown with Ultron, Rhodey remained within the restructured Avengers lineup, while Tony stepped away. They talked frequently. Sometimes late at night, Rhodey would check in on Tony to make sure he was holding up. Their conversations often drifted to simpler times, cracking jokes about their early adventures, or reminiscing about their Air Force Academy days, giving Tony a much-needed break from his anxious mind. Rhodey helped Tony test new prosthetic leg braces for injured veterans, a project Tony undertook quietly as a way of giving back. In these acts of service, Rhodey saw the true character of Tony shining through, beyond the armor and ego. Beyond Pepper and Rhodey, Tony had also formed familial bonds with the other Avengers. In calmer days, he hosted gatherings at Avengers Tower, where comrades like Bruce Banner and Natasha Romanoff would share a meal and conversation, and the playful wit of Tony would keep everyone entertained. Perhaps the most complex of these friendships was with Steve Rogers, Captain America. Steve and Tony were men from vastly different worlds, one a billionaire futurist, the other a humble soldier out of time, yet they fought side by side against common threats. Over the years, Tony grew to respect the unwavering principles of Steve Rogers and his steady leadership. There were moments when Tony looked at Steve and saw the kind of selflessness he aspired to. They had laughed together, celebrated victories together, and saved each other many times. Steve was not just a colleague to Tony. He was a friend, a brother in arms. That made the events that followed all the more tragic for Tony, because even the strongest bonds can be tested by opposing beliefs. Chapter 5: A Rift Between Heroes. Not long after Ultron, a pressing question loomed. How could the Avengers prevent such tragedies from happening again? The governments of the world believed they had an answer. They proposed the Sokovia Accords, an international agreement to regulate and oversee the activities of enhanced individuals. The Accords would require the Avengers to operate under the authority of a United Nations panel. Tony, burdened by guilt from Ultron and other collateral damage, felt this oversight was not only justified but necessary. He remembered the grieving faces he had seen and the harsh words of a mother who had lost her son in Sokovia, a chance encounter that struck Tony like a dagger to the heart. The weight of those lost lives pressed on him, By signing the Sokovia Accords, Tony saw a chance to take responsibility and prevent future mistakes. It was a way to reassure the public that heroes like himself were accountable. However, not all of his friends agreed. Steve Rogers stood firmly on the opposite side of the issue. To Steve, surrendering the Avengers' autonomy meant possibly betraying the very principles of freedom and justice they stood for. He had seen institutions become corrupt, and he feared that political agendas could tie the hands of the Avengers when they were needed most, or force them into actions that served only certain interests. The disagreement over the Accords cut to the core of the values held by Tony and Steve. Where Tony now saw oversight as prudent, Steve saw it as potentially dangerous. The once tight-knit Avengers began to fracture under this philosophical divide. The situation escalated when a terrorist attack killed the King of Wakanda, and evidence falsely implicated Bucky Barnes, Steve's old friend, as the bomber. Refusing to abandon his friend, Steve went off the grid to protect Bucky, defying the new Accords. To the world, it looked as though Captain America had turned vigilante, flouting the very law he fought for. Tony was torn. On one hand, he understood why Steve wanted to protect his friend. On the other, Tony felt a duty to uphold the law he had endorsed. Ultimately, Tony agreed to help bring Steve and Bucky in, hoping to do so peacefully and avoid anyone getting hurt. It was a heartbreaking position for him, being asked to hunt down a man he admired. The government treated Steve as a criminal, but Tony still saw his friend. He thought if he could just talk to Steve, maybe they could find common ground. That chance came at a German airport where Steve's team, including loyal friends like Sam Wilson and Wanda Maximoff, attempted to escape with Bucky. Tony arrived with his own smaller team of Avengers who supported the Accords, including Rhodey, Vision, and a newly recruited Peter Parker in his Stark-made Spider-Man suit. The morning was tense and overcast as the two sides squared off on the tarmac among parked airplanes. Tony felt heavy-hearted seeing Clint Barton, Hawkeye, and Natasha on the opposite side, but he tried to maintain a diplomatic tone. They were all friends once. None of them truly wanted to fight. But neither Steve nor Tony could yield on their principles. Words failed, and conflict became inevitable. The battle that followed was fast, yet sorrowful. As Iron Man and Captain America traded blows, there was an undercurrent of reluctance in each strike. Tony held back as much as he could, and he could tell Steve was pulling his punches too. Around them, former comrades paired off in skirmishes that felt more like desperate arguments than true fights. There were flashes of the old camaraderie, even in the midst of conflict, quips exchanged, concerned shouts to hold back a blow that might truly hurt. But accidents happen in the fog of war. At one critical moment, Vision miscalculated a blast aimed at Falcon. It struck Rhodey instead, disabling his armor. High above the ground, Rhodey's suit lost all power. Tony and Sam watched in horror as Rhodey spiraled downwards, unable to control his fall. The sickening thud of War Machine crashing into the earth was followed by a haunting silence. Tony felt his heart drop. He rushed to the side of his best friend, fearing the worst. Rhodey was alive, but gravely injured. The impact shattered his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Kneeling in the dirt beside Rhodey, Tony felt a surge of guilt and anguish. This was exactly the kind of harm he had wanted to prevent, happening now to someone he loved because of a fight with people he once called family. After that tragedy, the fighting abruptly ceased. Steve and his teammates retreated in the confusion and went to confront the real mastermind, the terrorist Helmut Zemo, who had orchestrated the rift from the shadows. Tony let them go. The cost had already been too high. Later, determined to make amends and hear Steve out, Tony followed their trail to a remote Siberian bunker where Zemo had lured Steve and Bucky. It was there that Tony learned a devastating secret, one that Zemo cruelly revealed to turn the Avengers against each other one last time. Security footage showed that years ago, a brainwashed Bucky Barnes had attacked a car and murdered the occupants, Howard and Maria Stark, the parents of Tony. In that moment, it was as if the world stopped for Tony. The horror of seeing the grainy footage of his mother and father's final moments, and the realization that Steve knew Bucky had done this but kept it hidden, was too much. All the pain, grief, and unresolved longing for his parents transformed into a blind rage inside Tony. He felt deeply betrayed that Steve had kept this secret, and he was overcome with sorrow for the violent deaths of his mother and father. In the dimly lit bunker, Tony, Steve, and Bucky erupted into brutal combat. This was no measured clash of ideals. It was raw, personal, and filled with years of emotion. Iron Man fired the repulsors built into his armor, Captain America's shield flew, and the Winter Soldier fought with desperate strength. His voice cracked with fury and pain as Tony traded blows with Steve, venting the hurt he had bottled up for so long, not just over his parents, but over everything that had led them to this moment. Steve tried to reason even while defending Bucky, apologizing with genuine regret, but Tony was past hearing it. The fight ended only when Steve disabled the arc reactor on the Iron Man suit, causing the armor to power down and collapse. Standing over Tony, Steve realized how far their friendship had fallen. In a final act of sorrow, Steve dropped his shield, the symbol of Captain America, given to him by Howard Stark, and left it behind, as if relinquishing the mantle out of respect for the loss Tony had suffered. Then Steve helped Bucky to his feet and limped away, disappearing into the icy dusk. In the days that followed, Tony helped Rhodey begin an arduous recovery. He built advanced leg braces that allowed Rhodey to walk again with effort, and he stood by his friend during painful rehabilitation sessions. Still reeling from the fracture of the Avengers, Tony found solace where he could. One day, a package arrived for Tony at the Avengers facility, a heartfelt letter from Steve Rogers. In it, Steve apologized deeply for everything that had happened and for the lies he had kept. He expressed understanding for how Tony felt and assured Tony that, despite their differences, he would always be there if ever needed. The letter came with an old flip phone, a direct line for Tony to call if he needed help. Reading the sincere words Steve had written in the stillness of his office, Tony felt a lump in his throat. He realized that while their trust had been damaged, their bond as friends was not truly gone. There was still a bridge, however fragile, between them. Tony locked the phone away for the time being, unsure if or when he would use it, but comforted by the knowledge that Steve still cared. It was a small ray of light breaking through the clouds of their conflict. Chapter 6: Guiding a Young Hero. Despite the fractures in his world, a new source of inspiration emerged that helped pull Tony back into the light. A brilliant teenager named Peter Parker. Tony had first crossed paths with Peter during the turbulent time of the Avengers Rift. Amid tracking down Steve, Tony discovered footage of a young New York City vigilante swinging through the streets in homemade web shooters. Ever the engineer, Tony was intrigued by the technology and agility he saw. Investigating quietly, he deduced that Spider-Man was Peter Parker, a gifted high school student. Tony paid Peter a surprise visit in Queens, showing up in the modest apartment Peter shared with his Aunt May under the pretense of offering a grant. In reality, Tony gently revealed that he knew Peter's secret and extended an invitation for something greater. Over a kitchen table conversation, Tony could see that Peter was simultaneously panic-stricken and excited. There was an earnest goodness in the kid, a genuine desire to help others that reminded Tony of why he became a hero in the first place. Impressed by how determined Peter was to do the right thing, and by the homemade suit he had seen stuffed in Peter's closet, Tony decided to take the teenager under his wing. He provided Peter with a sleek new Spider-Man suit packed with advanced features, a gesture to empower the young hero and keep him safer in action. When Tony later found himself needing extra assistance to contain the team led by Steve, he brought Peter along to the airport fight, instructing him carefully and ensuring he stayed relatively safe. Peter was awestruck to be in the company of seasoned heroes, and though the circumstances were fraught, Tony could not help but feel a paternal pride at how well Peter handled himself. In the aftermath of that clash, Tony felt responsible for Peter. This teenager had immense power and potential, and Tony understood the importance of guiding him correctly. Back in New York, Tony continued to mentor Peter from afar. He set Happy Hogan as a point of contact to give Peter missions of increasing importance, mostly small neighborhood help, as Tony wanted Peter to crawl before he ran. Tony monitored his progress through a link in the suit, often watching via video feed as Spider-Man stopped petty crimes after school. It gave Tony solace to focus on nurturing one bright soul, especially when so much else in his life felt broken. At times, Tony would call Peter personally to give a bit of advice or a gentle scolding if the impulsive teenager overstepped. Peter, eager to impress, sometimes bit off more than he could chew. In one incident, Peter attempted to thwart an arms deal on the Staten Island ferry without waiting for FBI backup. The situation went awry, and the ferry was nearly split in two by a powerful weapon. Disaster loomed, but Tony intervened in the nick of time, remotely piloting one of his Iron Man armors to stabilize the ferry and save everyone on board. Afterward, Tony met Peter atop a quiet rooftop at sunset. In that golden hour light, Tony spoke to Peter not as a boss, but as a caring mentor, almost a father figure. He expressed his disappointment, but also that his concern for Peter was very deep. Tony stressed that being a hero is as much about responsibility as it is about bravery. In a stern yet caring decision, Tony took back the advanced suit, telling Peter he needed to prove that he could be heroic without it. The young man was crushed, but Tony hoped the lesson would sink in. The measure of a hero is their heart, not their gadgets. Peter did learn and grow. A short time later, he faced the same criminal arms dealer, the Vulture, on his own, without any advanced technology from Tony, and managed to thwart the villain in the end using sheer determination and cleverness. Tony learned that Peter had succeeded and was quietly proud. Peter had demonstrated exactly what Tony wanted him to, that he could be selfless and brave, relying only on himself. Not long after, Tony invited Peter and even Aunt May to the Avengers compound under a happy pretense. In a bright sunlit press room, Tony offered Peter a surprise: a brand new Iron Spider suit and an official place among the Avengers. It was a moment of pride and triumph that Tony had envisioned, almost like a graduation ceremony for his young protege. But to Tony's surprise, Peter politely declined the offer, choosing instead to remain a friendly neighborhood hero a while longer. That answer, so humble and wise for a 15-year-old boy, made Tony smile. He realized Peter was growing into the kind of person who understood the value of simply helping on a small scale without the need for recognition. This grounded decision by Peter reassured Tony that the young hero had a strong moral compass. As a capstone to this period of his life, another joyous development unfolded. Pepper Potts came back. After some time apart and after healing from their stresses, Tony and Pepper found their way to each other again. Tony, learning from past mistakes, was more open about his fears and hopes with her, and Pepper saw that Tony had matured through his experiences. In that same press conference where Peter declined the Avengers, Tony seized the moment and a bit of media confusion to finally propose to Pepper. He presented her with an engagement ring, his eyes full of hope. Pepper said yes, her face lighting up with happiness. It was an intimate, tender moment shared under the gaze of a few reporters, but to Tony, it felt like the world had melted away until only he and Pepper existed. After everything he had been through, the battles, the losses, the sleepless nights, here was a win that meant more to him than any other. The embrace from Pepper was warm and real, the promise of a loving future that Tony had long dreamed of but rarely believed he deserved. In the weeks that followed, Tony's life felt fuller than it had in ages. He was mentoring a young hero who gave him renewed purpose, and he was planning a wedding with the woman who was his greatest love. He even reconciled with an old friend, Happy Hogan, who returned to his security detail and daily life, joking about taking on wedding planning duties. These were good days for Tony Stark. There were still shadows in his past and concerns in his mind, but as he stood on the balcony of the Avengers facility, looking out at a peaceful sunset, Tony allowed himself to savor the present. He had grown so much from the man he once was. The arrogant arms dealer had transformed into a mentor, a partner, and a guardian of the innocent. Each night he felt a little more at peace, closing his eyes next to Pepper with a content heart. Yet even in this calm, Tony often found that even his dreams were not free of worry. The quiet ticking of the clock in the dark bedroom sometimes sounded like a countdown, and in the back of his mind, he could not entirely forget the feeling that something was coming. Chapter 7: The Looming Shadow of Thanos. High above, in the velvet darkness of space, a storm was brewing, one that Tony Stark had long sensed but could not fully name. Ever since the Chitauri invasion in New York, Tony had been burdened with a sort of sixth sense for impending doom. In restless dreams, he often found himself back on that alien mothership or witnessing a dreadful vision of the future. During the crisis with Ultron, Wanda Maximoff had touched his mind and unwittingly amplified those fears, giving him a glimpse of what might come. In that vision, Tony saw the Avengers defeated and Earth overrun by a merciless force from beyond the stars. Though it was only a nightmare, Tony woke from it trembling, convinced that some great threat was inevitably on the way. In truth, far out in the cosmos, the seeds of that threat had already been sown. A warlord known as Thanos had been slowly moving pieces into place, seeking artifacts of unimaginable power. Tony did not yet know the name Thanos, but the signs of his handiwork were there for those who connected the dots. The attack on New York with Loki and his alien army had been orchestrated by Thanos from the shadows. Other strange events across the galaxy also bore the influence of the Mad Titan. Thanos had a singular goal: to collect all 6 Infinity Stones, the primordial gems of creation, and use them to impose his twisted idea of balance on the universe. He believed that by exterminating half of all life, he could save the remaining half and prevent overpopulation and suffering. In his own warped logic, Thanos saw this act of mass destruction as mercy. For years he had been ravaging planets, slaughtering entire populations by force to achieve this so-called balance. And now, with the Infinity Stones, he aimed to do it on a universal scale with the snap of a finger. Of course, Tony remained blissfully unaware of these cosmic machinations while he guided Peter and planned his marriage. But he still felt something on the horizon. Small incidents pricked at his intuition, whispers of disturbances in distant realms, Thor being out of contact while pursuing cosmic mysteries, and briefings from Natasha about an ominous figure pulling strings in the far reaches of space. Tony prepared in the only way he knew how, through invention. Deep in his lab, he began work on a new kind of Iron Man armor, one that could respond instantaneously and adapt to any situation. Drawing on cutting-edge nanotechnology, Tony developed the Mark 50 armor, a suit housed within a sleek metal arc reactor on his chest that could flow over his body in seconds. It was a marvel of engineering, comprised of billions of nanites that could reshape into any weapon or tool he needed. Tony did not share too many details of this project with anyone, but Pepper noticed the late hours he was keeping again. Unlike earlier days, Tony was more open now. He confided to Pepper that this was just in case to work a precaution for threats unknown. Pepper understood. Though she worried, she knew that Tony's need to be ready was part of who he was. Sometimes at night, Tony would stand by the window, looking up at the stars. Pepper would find him there, arms crossed and gaze distant. When she asked what was on his mind, Tony spoke in a low, calm voice about the vastness of the universe. He admitted that ever since he flew through that wormhole years ago, he could not shake the feeling that something out there had fixed its eyes on Earth. Pepper gently took his hand and reassured him that whatever came, they would face it together, and that he was not alone anymore. Tony smiled and nodded, kissing her forehead, and they would go to bed. But even as he held Pepper close, Tony often stayed wide awake long into the night. In quiet moments, Tony also tried to mend fences with the past. He upgraded the leg braces that helped Rhodey walk, turning them into a flexible second skin so Rhodey could move without a limp. Their friendship grew even stronger through this period of healing. Tony also maintained a respectful distance with Steve and the other former Avengers, honoring the fact that Steve had trusted him with a way to reach out if needed. Tony had not used the emergency phone Steve sent, but he kept it charged and ready, locked away in a drawer. Now and then, he would catch himself glancing at that drawer, contemplating a reconciliation call. Perhaps, he thought, he would invite Steve to his wedding when the time came. Those hopeful thoughts were one way Tony coped and healed. Yet the world would not grant Tony Stark a quiet retirement just yet. One crisp morning, not long after Tony had finally set a wedding date with Pepper, the sky itself delivered a harbinger of the coming storm. A massive alien spaceship, ominous and ring-shaped, appeared without warning in the skies above New York City, right outside the building where Tony was meeting with Bruce Banner and Doctor Strange. The sight was surreal, like a dark cloud eclipsing the sun. People on the streets screamed and ran. Tony felt his heart pound. He had seen something like this before in his nightmares. As wind whipped through the city canyons, Tony removed the new arc reactor housing from his chest and slapped it onto his shirt, activating the nanotech armor that spread over him like quicksilver. In that instant, Tony Stark became Iron Man once more. Fully and without hesitation, the Protector awakened to face what he had long feared. Outside, chaos erupted as the ship's enormous maw loomed over Manhattan, but Tony remained calm and focused. He ascended into the sky alongside allies, bracing himself for the fight to come. For years, Tony had sensed an approaching danger from the stars, and now, at last, it had arrived. And yet, in that pivotal moment, he was not alone. He had Pepper's steadfast love giving him strength, Rhodey and Peter's trust pushing him forward, and the lessons of all his trials guiding his actions. As Tony Stark gazed into the heavens, he understood that every step of his journey, every triumph and every mistake had led him to this point. In the gentle stillness before battle, Tony allowed himself one hopeful thought. The sky was darkening with the shadow of the approaching foe, but even in that darkness, Tony believed there was light ahead. His greatest test was imminent. The Titan Thanos was coming. The very threat that had haunted Tony for so long was about to descend upon the world. In the final chapter of this saga, Tony's virtues and flaws alike would be put to the ultimate test. He would have to weigh the lives of others against his own, to make unfathomable sacrifices, and to summon every ounce of courage and love he had cultivated over the years. For now, in this quiet pause before the storm, we leave Tony Stark standing beneath a sky of countless stars, a man who has grown from a careless inventor into a true hero, standing at the cusp of fate. The night is peaceful, and Tony allows himself to hope that even in the darkness, there is light ahead. Iron Man Lore, Part 3, Endgame and Legacy. Chapter 1, The Mad Titan Arrives. Tony Stark had long been haunted by the possibility of a cosmic threat looming in the future of humanity. In a nightmare vision induced years before, he saw the Avengers fallen and Earth overrun by monstrous invaders, a premonition of disaster that Tony could never forget. That dark foreshadowing finally took shape in the form of Thanos, a powerful warlord from the ruined planet Titan. Thanos had a terrifying goal: to bring what he viewed as balance to the universe by obliterating half of all life. And to achieve this, he sought the 6 Infinity Stones, primordial crystals of immeasurable power. One by one, Thanos cut a bloody path across the stars to claim these stones, decimating entire civilizations in his wake. He ravaged Xandar to seize the Power Stone and slaughtered the surviving Asgardians to take the Space Stone from Loki, all while drawing ever closer to Earth with relentless purpose. That inevitable moment arrived on an otherwise calm day in New York City. Tony and Pepper were enjoying a quiet walk, discussing hopes for the future, when the sky was suddenly pierced by the roar of an alien spacecraft. A gigantic disc-shaped Q-ship descended through the clouds, casting a shadow over the city streets. From it emerged members of the Black Order, the elite lieutenants of Thanos sent ahead to collect the 2 Infinity Stones hidden on Earth. The sinister Ebony Maw, a gaunt sorcerer with telekinetic powers, floated above Greenwich Village, intent on wresting the time stone from Doctor Strange. By his side lumbered Cull Obsidian, a hulking brute eager to crush anyone in their path. In an instant, a peaceful afternoon turned into chaos. Tony wasted no time. He tapped the arc reactor on his chest, triggering his latest Iron Man armor to flow over his body in a wave of red and gold nanometal. Fully suited, he rocketed forward to confront the intruders alongside Doctor Strange and Wong, the guardian of the sanctum. Bruce Banner, newly returned from space with dire warnings of Thanos, stood with them as best he could. Even without the strength of the Hulk, Bruce provided steady insight into the looming threat that galvanized Tony to fight. A fierce battle erupted in the streets of Manhattan, but Tony fought with focused determination and clever ingenuity. He distracted Cull Obsidian with a barrage of repulsor blasts and decoy flares, while Wong conjured mystic portals and Doctor Strange cast spells to contain the telekinetic assault of Maw. Amid the chaos, young Peter Parker Spider-Man leapt into the fray as well, determined to help his mentor despite the danger. Together, the heroes managed to wound Cull Obsidian and drive him back. However, Ebony Maw succeeded in ensnaring Doctor Strange, binding the sorcerer with magical restraints. With the time stone still hanging around the neck of Doctor Strange, Maw retreated into his hovering Q-ship, carrying his captive with him. Tony refused to let Thanos get any foothold on this attack. As the Q-ship ascended into the sky, Iron Man streaked after it, flying higher and higher until he breached the atmosphere. Unbeknownst to Tony, Peter Parker had leapt aboard the departing ship as well, desperate to continue helping despite the risk of drifting into space. High above the Earth, Tony guided Spider-Man into the Q-ship interior, and the two embarked on an impromptu rescue mission. Inside the dimly lit alien craft, they found Doctor Strange and engaged Ebony Maw in a desperate struggle. Tony's armor reshaped itself into new weapons, an advantage of his advanced nanotechnology, and after a brief conflict, Maw was defeated and cast out into the void of space. Doctor Strange was freed, though shaken by how close Thanos had come to obtaining the Time Stone. With the immediate threat neutralized, Tony took command of the craft. He now faced a fateful choice: return home to Earth or continue onward into the unknown. Remembering his haunting vision and knowing that an even greater confrontation lay ahead, Tony decided to press forward. Rather than turn back, he set a course for Titan, hoping to catch the Mad Titan by surprise in his own territory. In the silent weightlessness of space, Tony steadied himself for the battle he knew was coming, unaware of just how great a trial awaited him. Chapter 2: Battle on Titan. When Tony and his companions arrived on Titan, they did not find Thanos immediately. Instead, they encountered a band of unexpected allies. The Guardians of the Galaxy, a motley crew of cosmic adventurers led by Peter Quill, had also traveled to Titan, hoping to stop Thanos. After a tense initial scuffle, both groups realized they shared the same goal and agreed to work together. On the barren, wrecked landscape of Titan under a hazy orange sky, Tony Stark joined Stephen Strange, Peter Quill, Nebula, and the others to devise a plan of attack. Dr. Strange used the Time Stone to peer into possible futures, searching for any scenario in which they could win. He saw over 14,000 potential outcomes of the coming conflict, and in only one of them did Thanos suffer defeat. The odds were nearly zero, yet that single glimmer of hope was enough to steel the weary hero's resolve. Armed with this knowledge, they prepared for the battle to come, determined to make that one chance count. Thanos soon arrived on Titan in a swirl of cosmic energy, stepping through a portal generated by his nearly complete Infinity Gauntlet. 4 of the 6 stones already gleamed on his gauntlet, each gem amplifying his formidable might. The Mad Titan was imposing, towering, armored, and utterly confident in his dreadful mission. Without hesitation, the united heroes sprang their trap, attacking together with everything they had. Doctor Strange unleashed golden bands of magic and conjured mirror images to confuse Thanos. Star-Lord and Rocket Raccoon strafed him with blaster fire from above, while Spider-Man swung around his massive frame, binding Thanos with webbing. Tony fought relentlessly, his Iron Man suit generating energy shields and high-impact strikes to counter Thanos' onslaught. At one critical moment, Nebula and Mantis managed to briefly subdue the Titan. Nebula stunned him with an electric charge as Mantis telepathically pushed Thanos' mind towards sleep. The team strained to pry the Infinity Gauntlet off the hand of Thanos. Inch by inch, the metal glove began to loosen from his grip. For a heartbeat, it seemed they might actually succeed. But fate turned in an instant. Nebula deduced from what Thanos said that he had sacrificed his own daughter Gamora to obtain the Soul Stone. Hearing this, Peter Quill was overcome by anguish and fury. Gamora had been the woman he loved. In a rash moment of grief, Star-Lord lost control. He struck Thanos across the face, shattering the fragile trance Mantis had induced. The others shouted for Quill to stop, but the damage was done. Thanos roared back to consciousness, and their one chance to defeat him slipped away. The Titan broke free of their hold with a surge of strength, hurling the heroes back in all directions. With ruthless fury, Thanos unleashed the power of his stones, tearing apart the illusions Strange had created, tossing aside the Guardians, and bringing Iron Man to his knees. Tony could only watch in dismay as their carefully laid plan fell to ruin. In a final, valiant effort, Tony hurled himself at Thanos, deploying a nanotech blade in a bid to disable him. He managed to slice Thanos, drawing a single drop of blood. But Thanos merely sneered at the gesture. With a powerful backhand swing, he seized a shard of the nanotech blade Tony had created and drove it through Tony in the abdomen, impaling him straight through the body. Tony collapsed onto the rubble, gravely wounded. Thanos stood over the fallen hero and, with a solemn hint of respect, remarked that he hoped the people of Earth would remember what Stark had done. Before Thanos could execute Tony, Doctor Strange made a desperate move. He knew that keeping Tony alive was the key to that one winning future. "Stop," Strange called out, and offered Thanos the Time Stone in exchange for sparing the life of Tony. Thanos paused, then accepted. The green gem floated from the hand of Doctor Strange into his grasp, completing the Infinity Gauntlet. True to his word, the Titan refrained from killing Tony. Instead, Thanos gave the wounded Iron Man one final, inscrutable look and vanished through a portal, bound for Earth to claim the last remaining Infinity Stone. Tony was left alive on Titan, but utterly devastated by the defeat. In the aftermath, an eerie silence fell over Titan. Tony, barely conscious and bleeding, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Suddenly, a new horror unfolded. Far across the galaxy, Thanos had fulfilled his goal. With a snap of his fingers, powered by all 6 stones, he had wiped out half of all life. Now the effect of that snap reached Titan. Tony stared in disbelief as one by one his friends began to disintegrate into drifting ashes. Drax and Mantis were the first to crumble into dust before his eyes. Doctor Strange met Tony's eyes with sad understanding. His final words were that surrendering the stone had been the only way. Then Strange, too, dissolved into nothing. Desperately, Tony turned to Peter Parker, who stood trembling and afraid. The young Spider-Man staggered toward Tony and fell into his arms, his voice quavering. "Mr. Stark, I do not want to go," Peter whimpered as his body began to fade. Tony's eyes filled with tears as he held the boy he regarded as a son. But in seconds, Peter was gone, his ashes fluttering away into the air. In mere moments, all of his newfound allies had vanished. Only he and Nebula remained amid the desolation. Nebula, hardened by loss, simply stated the awful truth. Thanos had won. Tony sank down, trembling and hollow-eyed, surrounded by silence and drifting dust. He had fought with every last measure of his strength and genius, and still it had not been enough. The weight of failure settled on him like a shroud. On that distant dead world under alien skies, Tony Stark, the invincible Iron Man, bowed his head in sorrow, utterly alone in defeat. Chapter 3: Aftermath of Ashes. In the silence after Thanos vanished, Tony and Nebula were marooned on Titan with no way home. Eventually, they found the Benatar battered, but still intact enough to fly. With heavy hearts, the two survivors set a course for Earth and lifted off from the scarred surface of Titan. As they drifted through the solar system, Tony and Nebula did what they could to keep the Benatar functioning, but its damage was severe. They managed to improvise some repairs to extend life support for a few days, yet before long, the fuel cells of the ship gave out completely. The stars outside were cold and unblinking as the Benatar became a silent derelict coasting on inertia. Food and water ran dangerously low, and oxygen was nearly spent. In that quiet, lonely darkness, Tony Stark faced the very real possibility that he would not make it home. In the dim cabin of the ship, Tony recorded a farewell message for Pepper Potts. Using his Iron Man helmet as a camera, he spoke softly, voice calm but tinged with regret. He explained that he was adrift in space with no hope of rescue, and that by the time Pepper heard this, his journey may have reached its end. There was sorrow in his words, but also a gentle acceptance. Tony thanked Pepper for their life together and expressed his deepest love. He told her that she had always been his guiding light, and that when he drifted off to sleep for the final time, he would dream of her. With that, having said everything he needed to say, Tony leaned back against the metal wall and closed his eyes, ready to embrace the end. But destiny had other plans. As Tony lay weak and fading, a distant light appeared in the abyss of stars. It grew from a faint spark to a radiant glow outside the cockpit of the Benatar. Too weak to stand, Tony could only watch in a daze as the source of the light revealed itself a lone figure shining with cosmic energy, hovering just beyond the glass. It was Carol Danvers, known as Captain Marvel, arriving like an angel at the 11th hour. She peered into the craft and saw Tony and Nebula inside, frail and exhausted. A moment later, Carol gently guided the Benatar and its passengers back toward Earth. Against all odds, Tony Stark, on the brink of death minutes before, had been saved at the last possible moment. The Benatar touched down on Earth at Avengers headquarters, where the surviving Avengers rushed out to meet it. Pepper Potts was among them, heart pounding with anxiety. When Tony emerged, gaunt and unsteady, Pepper ran to him and wrapped him in her arms. They held each other tightly, both overcome with emotion. Tony's eyes welled with tears as he murmured an apology for making her worry. Pepper, voice trembling, told him he was home now and safe. It was a moment of quiet solace amid the prevailing sorrow. Tony was alive, and for a heartbeat, nothing else mattered. Not long after, once Tony had been given medical attention and time to recover some strength, he and the other Avengers gathered to decide what to do next. Tony, still pale and hollow-cheeked, recounted the grim events on Titan, how they had fought Thanos and how they had lost. His voice shook with anger and hurt as he spoke. Steve Rogers tried to reassure Tony that they would find a solution, but Tony, heartbroken and angry, unleashed his bitter frustration. In Tony's mind, the Avengers had been torn apart before the war with Thanos, and that disunity had led to this tragedy. With tears in his eyes, he pulled the arc reactor off his chest, the very device that once kept him alive, and pressed it into Steve Rogers' hand. It was a gesture of deep anguish. Tony felt he had given everything he had, only to lose. The others stood in silence, sharing in his heartbreak. Overwhelmed by emotion and exhaustion, Tony then collapsed. Steve and Bruce caught him and gently moved him to rest as Tony drifted into unconsciousness. The toll of battle and despair had finally overtaken him. In the days that followed, the remaining Avengers decided on a last-ditch plan to avenge what was lost. Through Nebula, they discovered a clue. Thanos had retreated to a distant garden planet after the snap. Carol Danvers joined the team, determined to help hunt him down. Tony, still recovering and emotionally raw, chose not to accompany them on this mission. He was in no condition to fight, and perhaps in his wounded heart, he had lost the will to try. So Steve, Thor, Natasha, Bruce, Carol, Rhodey, Rocket, and Nebula set out without him. They tracked Thanos to a remote farm planet and stormed his hut. Thanos, now injured and scarred from his own actions, did not resist. He somberly revealed that he had used the Infinity Stones one final time to destroy the stones themselves, reducing them to atoms so that his work could never be undone. The Avengers were stunned and horrified. Their last hope of reversing the catastrophe was gone. Enraged by this revelation, Thor acted on impulse. With a furious cry, he swung his enchanted axe Stormbreaker and beheaded Thanos, killing the tyrant in an instant. Silence fell in the wake of the strike. The surviving Avengers realized that even with Thanos dead, their victory was hollow. Half the universe was still gone, and now nothing could change that. Defeated and heartsick, the heroes returned to Earth to pick up the pieces of a world forever altered. Chapter 4: A Quiet Life. Time passed. Days turned into months, and months into years. The catastrophic loss the world had suffered slowly became part of everyday life. In the midst of this changed world, Tony Stark sought refuge in a simpler existence. He and Pepper quietly moved away from the ruins of their former lives to start anew in a secluded lakeside cabin surrounded by forests. In the spring following the defeat of Thanos, Pepper gave birth to a baby girl, whom they named Morgan Stark. For Tony, holding his daughter for the first time was a profoundly healing moment. In that tiny face, he saw pure innocence and hope, a reason to continue living. 5 years rolled by. By 2023, Tony was a very different man from the one who had once been front and center as Iron Man. He spent his days in domestic tranquility, raising Morgan alongside Pepper with all the love in his heart. In the mornings, Tony often cooked their family breakfast, with little Morgan perched on a stool eager to help stir pancake batter. On sunny afternoons, he showed Morgan how to skip stones across the surface of the lake, or let her play with one of his old Iron Man helmets as they made believe heroic adventures in the yard. Every night, Tony would kneel by her bedside as she got ready to sleep. The little girl insisted on telling her dad how much she loved him. "I love you 3,000, she would say, using the biggest number she knew. Those words melted his heart each time. He would smile, kiss her forehead, and whisper that he loved her more than anything. In those quiet years, Tony found a kind of peace that he had never known in all his years of battles and crises. He had saved the world many times, but now his world was the soft laughter of his daughter, the steady companionship of his wife, and the calm lapping of waves on the lake at twilight. This peace was interrupted one day by an unexpected visitor. Steve Rogers, along with Natasha Romanoff, arrived at the lakeside cabin bearing a wild yet hopeful idea. They sat down with Tony on his porch as the sun filtered through the trees and explained that Scott Lang, Ant-Man, had recently emerged from a quantum realm experiment with a startling discovery. To Tony's amazement, Scott had experienced a sort of time dilation while trapped in the subatomic quantum realm. To him, 5 years passed in just a few hours. This opened up a possibility that had once seemed impossible, using the quantum realm to travel through time. Steve and Natasha carefully laid out their plan, essentially a time heist to retrieve the Infinity Stones from the past and use them to bring back everyone who had been lost. Tony listened intently, his face unreadable. He glanced through the open doorway of the cabin, where Pepper and little Morgan were playing on the living room floor. The thought of meddling with time and possibly endangering his family made his blood run cold. With a heavy sigh, Tony told his friends that he could not help them. He thanked them for thinking of him, but gently insisted he dared not risk the fragile happiness he had finally found. Steve looked disappointed but understanding, and Natasha gave his hand a sympathetic squeeze before they departed. As their car disappeared down the dirt road, Tony stood on his porch, feeling the weight of a terrible choice. If there was even a chance to save billions to save Peter and all the others, how could he turn away? And yet, how could he jeopardize the family that gave him a reason to live again? That night, Tony found sleep elusive. He wandered into his study, mind churning with possibilities. Despite his reluctance, the engineer in him could not resist at least examining the problem. He pulled up a holographic display and began to toy with models of the quantum realm, running calculations late into the night. It was as if a puzzle had been placed before him, and piece by piece he started to solve it almost involuntarily. Hours later, to his own surprise, the solution clicked into place. Tony discovered a method to navigate the quantum vortices and emerge at precise points in time, effectively creating a stable path for time travel. He sat back in his chair as the realization sank in, a mix of triumph and trepidation coursing through him. On a shelf nearby sat a framed photograph of Tony with a young Peter Parker, both grinning widely at some long-ago memory. Tony picked up the photo and ran a finger over it gently. The ache in his heart told him what he had to do. He knew he could never truly rest unless he tried to set things right. The next morning, Tony shared his discovery with Pepper. They stood outside by the lake, the mist of dawn rising off the water. Tony admitted that he had solved the time travel equation. Pepper's eyes searched his. She knew what this meant. Softly, she asked Tony if he could bear to ignore this chance. Tony shook his head, tears threatening as he replied that he could not. Pepper placed a hand on his cheek, offering a sad, loving smile. She told Tony that she understood that she had long known the hero in him would never forgive himself if he did not try. Whatever comes, she said, she and Morgan would be all right. Tony exhaled and pulled Pepper close as the sun peeked over the trees. In that silent embrace, everything was decided. Later that day, Tony drove to the Avengers compound to rejoin his old friends. Steve Rogers and the others were shocked, then overjoyed when Tony arrived carrying a metal briefcase and an old circular shield. Tony greeted Steve with a tentative smile and opened the case. Inside was Captain America's shield, repaired and gleaming. He returned the shield to Steve, a gesture of reconciliation that immediately moved Steve to tears. The two men, brothers in arms who had been estranged for too long, nodded to one another with deep respect and renewed trust. With that healing of old wounds, the Avengers were assembled once again. Tony then revealed that he had cracked the mystery of time travel. With help from Scott Lang and with Bruce Banner providing scientific insight, he presented a plan to build a stable quantum tunnel that would allow them to journey into the past and back. The teammates exchanged determined looks. For the first time in 5 years, real hope shone in their faces. Without wasting any time, Tony and the Avengers got to work. In a flurry of activity, they constructed a makeshift time travel platform in an empty hangar of the compound. Bruce Banner fine-tuned the quantum calculations, while Tony engineered handheld GPS devices to anchor the travelers in time. After tireless effort, they were ready to test the system. Clint Barton, Hawkeye, volunteered to be the test subject. Donning a specialized white and red quantum suit, Clint stepped onto the platform. In a blink, he vanished into a swirling portal and was hurled through time. Long seconds ticked by as the others held their breath. Then Clint reappeared, gasping, alive and holding a baseball glove that belonged to his daughter. The test had worked. Clint was on the verge of tears as he realized he had briefly heard the voices of his children in the past. The success filled the Avengers with renewed energy. Their mission now had the green light. They devised a meticulous plan. Each Infinity Stone would be targeted at a moment and place in history where the Avengers could safely retrieve it without disrupting too much. Tony and Steve would travel back to the Battle of New York in 2012 to obtain the Space Stone, the Tesseract, and Mind Stone hidden within Loki's scepter. Bruce would also go to 2012 to convince the Ancient One to relinquish the Time Stone in Greenwich Village. Thor and Rocket would journey to Asgard in 2013 to reclaim the Reality Stone, which at that time was in the form of the Ether inside his mother Frigga, who was gravely ill. Nebula and Rhodes would go to Morag in 2014 to snatch the Power Stone just before Peter Quill originally found it. And Natasha and Clint would travel to distant Vormir in 2014 to obtain the Soul Stone. Each team suited up, aware that this mission could be as dangerous as anything they had ever attempted. Before they departed, Tony pulled Steve aside. The two shared a quiet moment of mutual resolve, acknowledging how far they had come and what still lay ahead. Steve promised Tony that they would see this through together, no matter what. Tony nodded gratefully. Despite the uncertainties, he felt profound relief that he did not have to shoulder this burden alone. One by one, the teams activated the quantum platform and vanished into spirals of light. Tony found himself emerging in the midst of New York City, but not the New York of 2023. He had arrived in 2012, at the climax of the Battle of New York when the Avengers first assembled. It was surreal for Tony to see his past self in the bulky Mark Zagg's Iron Man armor, flying alongside the other original Avengers amid the chaos of an alien invasion. Hiding in the shadows with Steve and Scott, who had accompanied them to help, Tony focused on their objectives: the Tesseract containing the Space Stone and Locust Scepter containing the Mind Stone. Through a series of clever maneuvers, Tony and Scott managed to get their hands on the Tesseract after the past Avengers had secured Loki. However, just as Tony was walking off with the briefcase containing the cube, a mishap occurred. The Hulk of 2012, storming down a stairwell and frustrated that he had to take the stairs, burst through a door and accidentally knocked Tony across the room. The Tesseract slipped from Tony's grasp and skidded across the floor right to the feet of the bound Loki, who promptly snatched it up. In a blink, Loki vanished in a flash of blue light, the Tesseract and Space Stone disappearing with him. Tony's heart sank. They had lost one of the stones. Thinking quickly, Tony and Steve improvised a fallback plan. They still had one Pym particle each for a return trip, and Tony realized there was a place and time where both the Space Stone and more Pym particles could be obtained together. Camp Lehigh, New Jersey, 1970. At that SHIELD facility, Howard Stark and Hank Pym would be working. The Tesseract was stored on site, and experimental Pym particles would also be available. Tony and Steve did not hesitate. Bidding farewell to Scott, who returned to 2023 with the Mind Stone from Loki's scepter, Tony and Steve activated their quantum GPS devices and leaped away into the time stream once more. In 1970, Tony found himself walking the halls of a U.S. Army base he recognized from old photos, the very place where he had been born. Disguised as a civilian contractor, Tony infiltrated an underground lab and located the Tesseract. He carefully extracted the blue cube and secured it in a briefcase. As he turned to leave, he nearly collided with a familiar figure rounding a corner, Howard Stark. Tony's breath caught in his throat. His father, decades younger, stood before him, engrossed in paperwork and utterly unaware of who Tony was. Summoning all his composure, Tony introduced himself under an alias, Howard Potts, and struck up a conversation. The two men ended up walking out to the parking area together, with Howard gratefully accepting assistance from Tony in carrying a box of office supplies. Tony's heart pounded with a mix of longing and closure. Howard spoke about his wife, Maria, who was pregnant with their first child. Howard admitted he felt nervous about becoming a father, wondering if he would be able to do right by his son once he was born. Tony, voice trembling slightly, assured Howard that he would be a great dad, that his son would be lucky to have him. Howard smiled, touched by the kind words from this stranger. He mentioned something his own mentor had told him, that no amount of money ever bought a second of time, and that family was worth every sacrifice. Tony felt tears in his eyes upon hearing these words from his father directly. At Howard's car, the two men shook the hand of his father warmly. "Thank you for everything," Tony said softly, voice full of meaning that Howard could not possibly understand. Acting on impulse, Tony gently pulled Howard into a brief hug. Howard, confused but polite, patted Tony's back and wished him luck. Tony watched as his father drove away, overwhelmed by a bittersweet peace. He had been given a gift few ever receive a chance to say goodbye. With the space stone secured and additional Pym particles gathered, Tony and Steve returned to the present of 2023. One by one, the other teams also reappeared on the quantum platform with their stones in hand, though not without cost. Natasha Romanoff did not return. When Clint emerged from the portal clutching the soul stone, he fell to his knees, sobbing. In halting words, he told the others that Natasha had sacrificed her life on Vormir so that he could obtain the stone. A heavy silence fell as the Avengers were confronted with yet another devastating loss. Tony bowed his head, grief-stricken at the death of his dear friend. They had regained so much, yet lost someone irreplaceable in the process. There was no time for prolonged mourning, but the pain in their eyes spoke volumes. Despite their sorrow, the Avengers pressed on with the task at hand. They now possessed all 6 Infinity Stones. Tony helped craft a new gauntlet using his nanotechnology, a nano-gauntlet designed to safely hold the stones. The question remained, who would wield it? Thor, desperate to undo his failure, volunteered, but given Thor had been in a fragile mental and physical state at the time, the others were hesitant. Ultimately, Bruce Banner stepped forward. As the Hulk, he reasoned, much of the radiation from the stones was gamma, something his altered biology could perhaps withstand. Reluctantly, the team agreed Bruce had the best chance to survive using the gauntlet. So they placed all 6 stones into the nano gauntlet. It resized itself, sliding over his massive arm. The moment Bruce put it on, energy pulsed through his being, surging up his arm in agonizing bursts. He cried out in pain, but managed a strained assurance that he was all right. The other Avengers took cover, and Tony stood back, heart pounding. This was it, their chance to bring everyone back. Summoning all his will, Bruce raised his seared arm and snapped his fingers. A blinding flash and a surge of heat filled the room, then silence. The nano gauntlet fell from the Hulk's seared hand. Bruce collapsed to one knee, half conscious and badly burned. But alive, Thor quickly moved in to support him. For an instant, no one knew if the plan had worked. Then his phone started ringing. It was Clint's wife calling, her name flashing on the caller ID. Outside, through the shattered glass of the facility's windows, birds began chirping in the trees, subtle signs of life returning. The Avengers exchanged hopeful looks. Slowly, they realized Bruce had succeeded. Half the universe had been restored in that single, universe-spanning moment. Tony's heart swelled as he thought of Peter Parker and everyone else they had lost, now alive again somewhere out there. He closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Before the Avengers could even celebrate, a terrible explosion ripped through the compound. The entire facility shook as missiles rained down from above, obliterating walls and floors in an instant. Thanos, the Thanos of 2014, who had learned of their plan, had arrived in 2023 with his warship. In one devastating strike, the Sanctuary 2 destroyed the Avengers compound, reducing it to smoking rubble. The ground buckled and collapsed, trapping the Avengers in debris. Tony managed to shield Rocket and Rhodey from the falling wreckage with a quick energy barrier from his suit. Dazed and coughing in the dust-filled darkness, Tony looked upward through a gaping hole in the structure to see Thanos himself descending from his ship in full armor. The final battle was about to begin. Chapter 5: The Final Battle. The Mad Titan sat ominously amid the ruins of the Avengers compound, awaiting his foes. Tony, Steve, and Thor were the first to emerge from the debris, bruised but determined. They gazed across the wreckage at Thanos, who twirled his double-bladed sword with a menacing calm. This Thanos did not yet have the Infinity Stones, but he had come prepared to complete his destiny by force. Exchanging nods, Tony, Steve, and Thor wordlessly spread out to engage him. The battle that ensued was fierce and thunderous, even without the stones. Thor summoned twin bolts of lightning, wielding Mjolnir, his hammer retrieved from the past, alongside Stormbreaker. Tony unleashed a torrent of missiles and laser beams, attacking from the air, while Steve charged forward on the ground with shield in hand. Thanos proved nearly unstoppable. He withstood the barrage Tony unleashed and flung Thor aside, then traded blows with Steve in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Skilled as Steve was, Thanos gradually gained the upper hand, pounding Steve with titanic strikes that cracked his unbreakable vibranium shield. Yet even as he was knocked down, Steve Rogers refused to yield. Bloodied and exhausted, he tightened the remaining strap of his broken shield across his arm and struggled back to his feet, prepared to face Thanos one-on-one. At that moment, Steve suddenly heard Sam Wilson's voice crackle over his earpiece. "On your left." Within seconds, shimmering portals of orange light began to open across the devastated battlefield. Doctor Strange had arrived, and with him came an army of allies. One by one, through the portals came the heroes and forces that the snap had taken away. The King of Wakanda, the Black Panther, stepped out with his warriors, letting out a triumphant war cry. The sorcerers of Kamartaj emerged in great numbers, their golden rings of magic lighting up the sky. The Guardians of the Galaxy rejoined the fray, with Star-Lord, Drax, Mantis, and a resurrected teenage Groot ready for battle. Falcon soared in on metal wings, joined by Winter Soldier, Scarlet Witch, and so many more. Even Pepper Potts arrived, clad in the blue and silver rescue armor Tony had built for her, determined to fight by the side of her husband. And then, swinging through a portal, came Peter Parker's Spider-Man, alive and well once more. Tony's eyes widened in relief and joy at seeing the boy he had mourned. Peter landed and looked around in amazement at the assembled allies. Finally catching sight of Tony, he rushed over. Tony could not contain his emotions. He pulled Peter into a tight embrace, the fatherly relief overwhelming him as Peter babbled about being gone only a short while due to Strange's portal. Tony simply held him close, whispering that he was so proud and so very glad to see him safe. Across the field, Steve Rogers took in the awe-inspiring sight of their gathered friends and armies, the forces of good, rallied at last. With righteous determination, Steve lifted Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, high and cried out the long-awaited call, "Avengers assemble." At that command, the heroes surged forward and the final battle truly began. A colossal clash erupted as both sides charged. The Avengers and their allies fought Thanos' invading army on all fronts, the sky filled with the streaks of sorcerers' spells and energy blasts. The ground shook as armies collided. Giant Man, Scott Lang at towering size, rose from the debris and delivered a mighty punch to a Leviathan, sending the massive alien creature crashing down. Thor and Captain America fought back-to-back, Thor bellowing with pride as Steve wielded lightning with Mjolnir alongside him to smash through hordes of outriders. In the air, Pepper, in her rescue armor, and Tony zoomed side by side, firing repulsor beams that sliced through the Chitauri forces of Thanos. On the ground, Clint Barton sprinted desperately with the nano gauntlet in hand, trying to keep the Infinity Stones away from Thanos. He passed the gauntlet off to Black Panther, who in turn hurled it across the battlefield to Spider-Man. Peter caught it and swung away, protecting the gauntlet as best he could. Seeing Peter in peril, Tony flew in and blasted apart the aliens swarming the young hero. "Here, kid, I got you," Tony said as Peter gratefully handed over the nano gauntlet. However, the enemy forces pressed in relentlessly. A hulking brute in his legion lunged at Tony, knocking the gauntlet from his grasp. In the chaos, the gauntlet skittered across the field and came to rest not far from Thanos himself. As Thanos zeroed in on the Infinity Stones, the battle reached a fever pitch. Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch, confronted Thanos with fury for what he had done to Vision and her friends, unleashing a wave of power that began tearing his armor apart. But Thanos, desperate, called down fire from his warship to bombard the field indiscriminately. Explosions blasted craters in the earth, momentarily halting her onslaught. Amid the smoke and fire, Tony spotted Dr. Strange across the way. Strange caught Tony's eye and raised one finger, silently signaling that this was the one chance. Tony's gaze shifted to Thanos, who had by now picked up the nano gauntlet and was placing it on his hand. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Tony dashed forward. He intercepted Thanos at the final moment, grappling with the Titan for control of the stones. Thanos was far stronger and easily swatted Tony aside, seemingly keeping the gauntlet firmly in his grasp. The Mad Titan grinned and declared, "I am inevitable," snapping his fingers only to find that nothing happened. In his arrogance, he had not noticed that Tony had plucked the Infinity Stones from the gauntlet at the last second, using his nanotech suit to absorb them onto his own right hand. Now the 6 stones glimmered along the knuckles of his right gauntlet, their combined cosmic power surging through him. Energy crackled over his armor, the raw force almost overwhelming him. But Tony mustered a final burst of resolve. Looking Thanos in the eye, Tony Stark echoed words he had spoken long ago at the very beginning of his journey. "And I am Iron Man." With a resolute snap of his fingers, Tony unleashed a blinding surge of energy. There was a brilliant flash and then profound silence. Thanos watched in stunned disbelief as his gargantuan warship, his armies, and even he himself began to crumble to ash. The Mad Titan stumbled and sat down heavily amid the wreckage, his once fearsome form dissolving into gray dust on the wind. His war was over, Thanos, and his hordes were wiped from existence, undone by the very power he had sought to wield. Yet the victory came at a terrible cost. The power of the Infinity Stones coursing through a mortal body was too much for Tony to bear. He had saved the universe, but his own life now hung by a thread. Tony collapsed against a pile of rubble, the right side of his armor and body badly charred by the immense energy. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes stared ahead, unfocused, on the verge of slipping away. The battlefield fell quiet as those around realized what had happened. One by one, they rushed to Tony's side. James Rhodes, War Machine, was first, kneeling and calling, "Tony," with panic in his voice. Tony recognized his best friend for an instant, but could barely speak. Peter Parker arrived next, tears streaming down his face as he grasped Tony's shoulders. "We won, Mr. Stark. We won." "You did it," Peter pleaded softly, refusing to accept what was happening. Tony could only manage a faint, loving smile in response. Finally, Pepper Potts moved beside Tony. She had removed her helmet, and though tears glistened in her eyes, she managed to smile gently at him. Pepper placed a hand on his chest right over the arc reactor and told Tony in a calm, tender voice that they were going to be all right. He could rest now. At those words, Tony Stark, the genius, billionaire, hero, found peace. Surrounded by his dearest loved ones and knowing that everyone was safe, Tony closed his eyes. The faint glow of his arc reactor flickered and then dimmed to darkness as he slipped away. Iron Man was gone. All around, the heroes bowed their heads in grief and respect. They had won the battle and saved countless lives, but they had lost the man who made that victory possible. Tony Stark had given everything to protect the world. In the quiet that followed, the Avengers and their allies silently honored his sacrifice, their hearts heavy even as a new dawn began to break over the horizon. Chapter 6. A Heroic Legacy. In the days after the battle, the world mourned and honored Tony Stark. At a secluded lake beside his home, a small funeral gathering took place for the fallen hero. The surviving Avengers and many friends came to pay their respects. They stood in somber silence beneath the tall trees, watching a gentle current carry a wreath out across the water. In the center of that wreath lay the first arc reactor Tony ever built, etched with the words, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart." Now a final tribute drifting away. Pepper stood arm in arm with Rhodey and Happy Hogan, quietly comforting young Morgan as the little girl tried to understand why her daddy was not coming home. Morgan looked up at Happy and told him that she wanted cheeseburgers, a simple request that made Happy smile sadly, recalling how Tony himself had loved cheeseburgers ever since he returned from captivity years ago. "Your dad liked those too," Happy whispered, promising Morgan that he would get her all the cheeseburgers she wanted. As the sun set on that day, it marked the end of an era. But the legacy of Tony Stark had only begun. In the weeks and months that followed, the lives he touched and the ideals he embodied continued to influence the world. The Avengers carried on, inspired by his memory to always stand ready against whatever threats might arise. His best friend Rhodey continued to serve as War Machine, flying missions in his honor and ensuring Stark technology remained a force for good. Peter Parker, the young man Tony had mentored, struggled with the loss, but ultimately took the lessons Tony taught to heart. He rose to become a steadfast hero, knowing that Mr. Stark believed in him. Pepper Potts, though grieving, founded organizations to help those displaced by the blip, the return of the vanished, and to continue the charitable works Tony had begun. She also guided Stark Industries in a new direction focused on sustainable technology, ensuring that Tony's creations would benefit the world as Tony had wished. Beyond the personal sphere, the impact Tony had was monumental. Monuments were erected and murals painted in cities across the globe, honoring Iron Man as the one who saved half of all life. In a memorial exhibit at the Avengers compound, re-established as a museum, a display was dedicated to his suits and accomplishments, with his original Mark I arc reactor at its center, still bearing a heartfelt inscription from Pepper, proof that Tony Stark has a heart. The public came to view these exhibits and remember the man who had openly declared himself a superhero so many years ago and then proved it with the ultimate act of courage. The legacy of Tony also extended to new generations of heroes. In the pages of Marvel Comics, where Tony Stark had lived in ink since the 1960s, His story continued to evolve, inspiring spin-off heroes and successors. His long comic book career showed him overcoming personal demons and technological challenges alike, from the famous Demon in a Bottle storyline addressing his battle with alcohol to the Armor Wars saga, where he fought to keep his inventions out of the wrong hands. In those pages, the influence of Tony Stark gave rise to allies like James Rhodes, who became War Machine, and a young genius named Riri Williams, who built her own suit of armor to become Ironheart. These characters carried forward Tony's ideals and innovations, reflecting how the actions of one hero can create a ripple effect of inspiration. In the cinematic realm, Tony Stark's influence was no less profound. In 2008, Iron Man was the movie that launched an entire universe of Marvel films. Actor Robert Downey Jr. portrayed Tony Stark from 2008 onward, and his remarkable performance elevated Iron Man into one of the most recognizable and beloved superheroes in the world. Through over a decade of films, audiences watched Tony grow from a self-centered weapons dealer into the devoted, selfless leader of the Avengers, a journey that made him one of the most beloved heroes of all time. His iconic final act, snapping his fingers while declaring "I am Iron Man," became an enduring symbol of heroism and sacrifice. The world was deeply moved by Tony's story, and even everyday people found inspiration in the bond Tony shared with his daughter. The phrase "I love you 3000" became a popular loving tribute after Endgame. The story of Tony showed that heroes can be flawed and human, yet still rise to do extraordinary things for the greater good. Through both triumph and tragedy, the legacy of Tony Stark endures. It lives on in the technology he pioneered, from clean energy arc reactors to advanced AI, continuing to shape the future. It lives on in the heroes who followed in his footsteps, in the brilliant inventions of Shuri in Wakanda, in Peter Parker, who upheld a strong sense of responsibility, and in every person who chooses to use their talents to help others, because Tony Stark showed them it was possible. And it lives on in the hearts of those who remember his story. As Pepper Potts once inscribed on the first arc reactor Tony ever had, he truly proved that he had a heart. In the end, the man who began as an arrogant genius in a cave became a symbol of selflessness and love. The journey of Tony Stark from building a suit to save himself, to ultimately giving his life to save everyone, reminds us that redemption is possible, and that even the biggest personalities can learn to put others before themselves. His tale has come to a close, but it echoes on in every life he touched. As we conclude this gentle chronicle of Iron Man lore, we can find comfort in how Tony Stark found peace at last. After a lifetime of challenges, he found love, purpose, and finally rest. Now, his watch has ended and he sleeps, having left the world safer and brighter than he found it. In our own quiet moments, we remember the soft lesson of his story, that the legacy of a hero of hope, courage, and kindness never truly dies, but shines on like a guiding star. Knowing this, we too can let go of our worries and drift into peaceful rest, secure in the light of the heroes who have shown us the way.